She had sewn $312 into the lining of her riding coat, every bill flattened and stitched with the precision of a woman who understood that money was the only thing between her and whatever came next. Beneath the seat of the westbound train, locked between her boots and held against her legs with both feet, sat a battered iron dispatch box that two men in suits had tried to take from her at the Dodge City station 17 days ago. She had not let them. She had stood on that platform with a carpet bag in one hand and the box under the other arm, and she had looked those two men in the eye, and she had said very quietly that she would scream until the entire Kansas Pacific Railroad heard her before she surrendered a single inch. They had retreated. The train had left. And now she was 40 miles from Redstone, New Mexico territory, watching the flat brown emptiness of Kansas give way to something older and redder and entirely unknown, and she was trying, for the first time in 6 months, to breathe. Her name was Clara Beecham, born Clara Vogel, daughter of a German land surveyor from Topeka, married briefly disastrously, and then suddenly widowhood to Preston Beecham, one of Abilene's most admired land attorneys. She was 31 years old. She had brown eyes with gold in them that Preston had once called remarkable, and then spent 3 years making certain no one else ever looked at long enough to notice. She had a mind that Preston had called exceptional, and a voice that Preston had spent those same 3 years teaching her to lower in company. She had a locked iron box that Preston had pressed into her hands in April with blood on his collar, and a look in his eyes she had never once seen there in 3 years of marriage. The look of a man who finally understood what he had done. "Keep it safe," he had said. "Everything's in there. Don't let Harlan get near it." Harlan, his brother-in-law. Judge Harlan Beale of the Missouri Circuit Court, the most respected jurist in 3 territories, the man whose name appeared on charitable endowments and civic dedications and the dedications of 2 Abilene churches. The man who had stolen $400,000 from a public land trust and then arranged for anyone who knew about it to become very quietly unavailable. Preston had known. Preston had been unavailable since May. The official verdict was cardiac arrest. He had been 38 years old and in excellent health, but men did die of cardiac arrest, and Judge Beale had wept at the funeral with the specific grief of a man performing grief for an audience. And Clara had stood at the graveside in her black dress with the iron box hidden in the false bottom of her traveling trunk. And she had watched Harlan weep, and she had understood with the cold clarity of a woman who has nothing left to lose exactly who she was dealing with. She had been running since June, and now in October of 1879, there was a letter. She had answered 6 advertisements in 3 different papers before she answered the one from Redstone. The others had offered things that frightened her in one way or another. Men who wanted someone young, men who wanted someone docile, men who described their expectations with the cheerful confidence of people who had never once considered that the woman answering might have expectations of her own. One man in Colorado had written that he preferred quiet women who did not hold strong opinions. She had used that letter to start her cooking fire. The Redstone advertisement was different. It was 6 paragraphs plainly written, and it said this: a rancher named Gideon Holt in the New Mexico territory required a wife not for sentiment but for practicality. He had 40 acres along the Cimarron Ridge, a water dispute that had been grinding him down for 9 years, a daughter of 10 who needed a capable adult woman in her life, and a ranch operation that needed someone who could read a contract and make a decision and not expect the frontier to look like the illustrations in Harper's Weekly. He offered honesty, a fair arrangement, and the acknowledgement that he was not a young man with romantic prospects. He offered no promises he didn't intend to keep. She had boarded the westbound train without writing back. The train from Dodge City arrived at the station in Sweetwater Crossing, New Mexico territory, at 11 in the morning on a Wednesday in late October, 40 minutes behind schedule, smelling of coal smoke and the particular exhaustion of people who had been sitting too long in close company. Clara Beecham descended to the platform with her carpet bag in one hand and the iron box under the other arm, and stood in the October heat and looked out at the largest sky she had ever seen in her life. She had grown up under Kansas sky. She had thought she understood sky. She understood now that she had been wrong. This sky did not merely exist above you. It pressed down patient and enormous, and the earth below it, red rock and pale sage, and the distant blue suggestion of a ridgeline running north answered the sky with its own kind of patience. It was a landscape that did not know her name and did not need to know it, and in that vast impersonal permanence, she felt for the first time in 6 months something that might eventually become peace. She exhaled. A boy of about 12 was asleep against a water barrel outside the station, hat over his face. "You know a man named Gideon Holt?" she asked him. He blinked awake, pushed back his hat, and took her in with the frank inventory of the very young. "Everybody knows Mr. Holt," he said. "Can you tell me how to reach his property?" "4 miles north up toward the ridge." He squinted at the iron box under her arm. "You the bride he sent for." The heat came into her face. She had not considered how quickly a town of 400 people would have assembled this particular fact from whatever evidence was available, and she had underestimated the speed by several days. "I'm Clara Beecham," she said, which she intended to answer the question. It seemed to satisfy him. He pointed her toward the livery stable. She walked with her spine straight and her eyes forward, and she did not look about her in the manner of a woman afraid of being watched. She had been that woman for a year. She had moved through the rooms of a fine house in Abilene, with her gaze cast down and her movements careful, and her voice always at the low register Preston had preferred, and she had told herself this was reasonable, and this was what marriage required, and this was simply how things were. She had survived that. She was done with it. The liveryman was a broad, sun-beaten man of 60 named Okafor, who had the manner of someone who noticed everything and mentioned nothing, and quoted prices that were honest and spoke not a word beyond what was necessary. He had her rolling north within 20 minutes. She sat on the wagon bench beside him and watched the town fall away and thought about the sum of the past 6 months, what they had taken from her and what they had given her, and whether those two accounts would ever balance. The land changed as they moved north. The flat shelf of the town gave way to rising country juniper on the slopes, red rock outcroppings, pale creek beds threading between rises. The sky kept opening, kept going, kept pressing the earth into sharper relief with every mile. She had not been prepared for this. She had prepared for a great many things. She had not prepared for the way this country made her own urgency feel like something happening at a significant distance. She did not find this comforting. She found it clarifying. They came over a low rise, and she saw the Holt property below a main house of adobe and rough timber, a barn with a recently mended roof, 2 outbuildings, a windmill turning in the breeze, a corral with horses moving in the afternoon light. It was not a large operation. It was not a wealthy one, but it was solid in the manner of a thing built by someone who expected it to last. The mended fencing, the orderly placement of the buildings the windmill maintained, and functioning rather than rusting and forgotten. She had lived in a house with 4 sitting rooms and a formal dining table that seated 20. This was nothing like that house. She found this unexpectedly a relief. Okafor drew up at the gate. She thanked him, paid him, and climbed down. She was halfway across the yard when the front door opened. The woman who appeared was not Gideon Holt. She was perhaps 38, fair-haired and handsome in the practical, health-made way of women who do not rely on delicacy for their looks. She wore an apron over a calico dress and held a damp cloth in her hands, and she looked at Clara with an expression that had been assembled with great care and was precisely 1 degree too controlled to be entirely welcoming. "Mrs. Beecham," the woman said. Clara did not slow her step. "Yes, I'm looking for Mr. Holt." "He's out with the cattle." The woman's voice was even measured, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this exact conversation and settled on exactly how she intended to play it. "I'm Agnes Pryor. I help out here." A pause, 1 beat too long. "Please come in. You've had a long journey." Clara came in. The inside of the house told her everything in the first 10 seconds. The curtains were pressed. A jar of dried wildflowers stood on the windowsill. The kitchen carried the slow, herbed smell of something that had been cooking since morning, the particular domesticity of a woman who had made herself at home in a home that was not yet officially hers, or that she had been quietly, deliberately converting toward her own design for it. A neighbor woman at the Dodge City station had told Clara with the relish of someone handing you something pointed that Gideon Holt had been keeping steady company with a widow named Agnes Pryor for close to 10 months. Clara had thanked her pleasantly and stored the information in the place where she kept things requiring careful consideration later. She was considering it now, sitting at Agnes Pryor's kitchen table, drinking Agnes Pryor's coffee, saying the correct things at the correct intervals with the smooth social ease of a woman who had spent 3 years performing gracious company at her husband's dinner parties for men who considered her decorative. Agnes was not hostile. Clara had braced for hostility and found instead something considerably more complicated, A woman managing herself with visible precision, playing a role she understood was slipping from her, doing it with enough dignity to be genuinely admirable, and enough strain beneath the composure to be genuinely painful to witness. She was not a petty woman, she was not a cruel one. She was a woman who had built something and was now watching someone else walk through the door, and she was handling it better than Clara would have predicted. She was still sitting there, the iron box in her lap, when the front door opened again. Gideon Holt was not what his letter had prepared her for. The letter had been plain-spoken in a way that suggested a plain man, and she had assembled a rough picture from the facts provided 42 years old rancher widower. One daughter had come to the territory after the war. She had expected weathered and taciturn and probably closed. He was all three of those things. He was also, she registered with a small and entirely unwelcome internal recognition, a man whose face showed the precise damage of long loneliness. Not the soft damage of self-pity, but the harder kind, the compression that comes from a man who has stopped expecting much from people and has organized his entire interior life around things that could not disappoint him. Land, work, the daily demands of animals and seasons. He was tall and lean with the leanness of labor rather than aesthetics, dark hair heavily threaded with silver hands calloused and very still at his sides. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and looked at her. The first emotion she could clearly read on his face was not welcome. It was guilt. "Mrs. Beecham," he said, "Mr. Holt." She rose because she was not going to have this conversation from a seated position. "Thank you for the invitation." Something crossed his face. He took off his hat, held it. He looked at her the way almost no one had looked at her in the past several years, with genuine attention, taking her actual measure rather than the measure of his assumptions about her. "How was the journey?" he said. "Along," she said. "But I'm here now." Agnes set a third cup on the table and excused herself with smooth efficiency, disappearing toward the back of the house with the practiced grace of a woman who knows precisely the moment to remove herself. She's rehearsed this too, Clara thought. 10 months of learning the exact timing. Gideon sat down across from her. He put his hat on the table between them. Neither of them reached for the coffee. "I owe you a straight conversation," he said. "A statement, not an apology, a statement of what was simply owed." "I believe you do," she agreed. He assembled his words with the deliberate care of a man accustomed to practical language, who is now being required to speak in a register that has no clean edges. "Agnes Pryor has been considerable help to me since her husband passed," he said. "She's become accustomed to how things run here." "And to you," Clara said. He met her eyes and did not look away. "Yes." "And the town has formed impressions." "Yes." She picked up her coffee and drank some. Good coffee, stronger than she preferred, which was already something she was filing away. "What do you want to do?" she asked. The question clearly surprised him. He was a man not often asked what he wanted. "I wanted a mother for my daughter," he said after a pause that lasted long enough to be honest. "Someone steady, someone who'd be here." He looked at his hat. "What I put in that advertisement was the truth. What this ranch needs is the truth. I won't pretend I've managed the situation well." "Nothing useful comes from pretending," she said. "No." And his eyes went briefly to the iron box in her lap and then with deliberate courtesy away. "That looks heavy." "It is," she said and did not explain further. They sat in the October afternoon light in Agnes Pryor's kitchen. Clara was already thinking of it that way, which was tactical as much as accurate, and they took each other's measure the way two people do who are both accustomed to measuring and are now measuring each other. "I'd like to meet your daughter," Clara said. Something eased in his expression, just fractionally, just enough. "She'll be back from the schoolhouse at 4, he said. "I'll take you over if you'd like." "Good." She rose, picked up her bags. "I'll need a room, not the largest, whichever's available." He stood. "There's one at the end of the hall, east-facing, small." "Small is fine," she said. "I don't require much space." This was not entirely true, but she said it with the conviction of a woman who has learned that the ground you claim in the first hour is the ground you stand on afterward. She followed him down the hall. The room was small and spare, with a narrow bed and a blue quilt and a window that looked out over the corral. Someone she suspected, Agnes, had put a sprig of dried sage in a jar on the sill. She didn't know whether this was a gesture of welcome or a territorial marker, and she supposed it didn't much matter which. She set the iron box on the floor beside the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress and pressed one hand flat against her riding coat, where $312 were sewn into the lining. She was not safe. She had bought herself time and distance, but she was not safe. Out in the kitchen, she could hear Agnes moving with the quiet competence of a woman who believed this was her house. Clara understood that kind of belief from the inside. She had once believed she was safe in a fine house in Abilene because a man with careful eyes had given her roses every Sunday and then very precisely taken everything else. She was not going to make that mistake again. She was also not going to be crowded out of a room she had been invited into. She rose, smoothed her skirt, opened her door. In the kitchen, Gideon was speaking quietly to Agnes near the stove. They stood close in the unconscious way of people who have grown accustomed to each other's proximity, not romantic exactly, but the intimate ease of shared daily life. When Clara Beecham appeared in the doorway, both of them looked up. Agnes went carefully neutral. Gideon went to something she could not yet name. "I thought I'd help with supper," Clara said pleasantly. "If there's anything that wants doing." A pause, 2 full seconds. "I've got it well in hand," Agnes said. "I'm sure you do." Clara pulled out a chair and sat at the kitchen table. "I'll keep you company then. I've been sitting on trains for 3 days and the kitchen smells wonderful." She sat there. She did not leave. After a moment, Agnes turned back to the stove. Clara found a bowl of dried beans on the table. She pulled it toward her, picked up the paring knife beside it, and began sorting through them with the precise, efficient movements of a woman who has done 10,000 small, domestic tasks without once being thanked. She did not look at Gideon. She did not need to. She could feel the room recalibrating itself around her, 3 people adjusting to a new arrangement, testing the new weights and distances, deciding what this situation was going to require of each of them. She had survived worse calibrations. Nora arrived at 4:15, carried home in a neighbor's wagon, and appeared in the doorway with her school bag and her lunch pail and a face full of assessment that made Clara immediately understand that this was the person whose verdict actually mattered in the Holt household. The girl looked at her the way very intelligent children look at unexpected things, not with hostility, but with the thorough, honest evaluation of someone who has not yet learned that frank scrutiny is considered impolite. She was dark-haired like her father, with a serious face and a jaw set with inherited stubbornness. 10 years old and already carrying the particular gravity of a child who has known loss and organized her whole self around it. "You're the lady from the advertisement," Nora said. "I am," Clara said. "Clara Beecham. It's good to meet you." "My papa says you're from Abilene." "I am." "He says your father was a surveyor." "He was." Nora considered this with the gravity it apparently deserved. "Can you ride a horse?" "Yes." "Mrs. Pryor can't," Nora said with the calm neutrality of a child reporting a meteorological fact. "She says they're unpredictable." From across the room, Clara felt Agnes elect not to respond to this. "Horses are reasonable animals," Clara said. "If you understand how they're thinking." Nora held her gaze for another moment, filed something, and went to wash her hands. Gideon was standing by the far window. When Clara glanced at him, he was watching his daughter with an expression she had not expected, love, so unguarded and complete that it had no idea it was showing itself. It sat naked on his face and he did not know it. He was not performing it. It simply was. She looked away quickly. It was too direct a thing to look at without feeling something, and she could not afford right now to feel anything she had not planned for. Dinner was an exercise in triangulation. Agnes served beautifully and spoke pleasantly and was clearly beloved by Nora in the way children love capable, consistent adults. Gideon said very little, which appeared to be his habitual manner. Clara listened and observed and said the right things at the right intervals, a skill she had refined over 3 years of her late husband's dinner parties, performing pleasant company for powerful men who considered her decorative and were occasionally baffled when she demonstrated otherwise. After dinner, Gideon offered to show her the property before dark. Agnes stayed to clean up. Nora announced she was coming too in a tone that made clear this was not a matter open for discussion. They walked out into the October evening. Clara, Gideon, Nora, and the sky had gone deep orange and red over the mesa, and the wind had dropped to almost nothing, and the desert held the day's heat in the earth the way a brick holds warmth slowly released long after the source is gone. "The north pasture is the best ground I have," Gideon said, pointing toward the darkening ridge. "Spring water comes down from the upper formation. The problem is the Callaway Land Syndicate has been contesting my rights to the source for 9 years. There's a survey conflict. He paused. It's what keeps me up at night. Do you have documentation, she asked. He glanced at her sideways. Some. Deeds, the original survey markers, your territorial filing. Some. Said with less confidence now, the pause of a man who knows the paperwork is a problem. My father surveyed property disputes for 20 years in Kansas, she said, looking out at the ridge going dark against the sky. I learned how to read the filings. He looked at her with a quality of attention that was new, something closer to genuine reassessment. That's useful, he said. I have various useful things, she said mildly. Nora had run ahead to check on the horse she favored. They stood in the fading light in a silence that was uncomfortable but honest, and there is a particular value to honesty, even when it sits poorly. I owe you an apology, Gideon said quietly, for the situation you're walking into. Agnes, it's complicated. It's not what it might appear, but it's also not nothing, and I didn't manage it well. She turned to look at him. The last light was going, and in the half-dark, his face was something carved from the same stone as the country formed by pressure, over a long time, not by anything gentle. Mr. Holt, she said, I'll tell you something true. I didn't come here the way most women come to these arrangements. My reasons were more complicated than loneliness. She paused. I'll tell you more when I know you better. What I want you to know tonight is that I have no intention of making your life harder. I intend to make it more workable. I'm a practical woman, and I do not frighten easily. He was quiet for a long moment. I believe you, he said. Good. She looked toward the dark where Nora had disappeared. Now let's go get your daughters before she decides to saddle up in the dark. They walked back toward the lighted windows of the house, and the stars came out above the mesa, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And Clara carried the iron box under her arm and her secrets in her chest, and she thought, I am alive. I am here. Whatever is coming, I am not waiting for it in Abilene. That night, she lay in the small, east-facing room and listened to the desert insects' wine horses shifting in the corral. She thought about Agnes Pryor somewhere in the same house, about Gideon Holt lying awake at the far end of the hall, which was almost certainly what he was doing, about Nora in her small room, sleeping the sound, organized sleep of a child who has made peace with what she cannot change. She thought about the iron box on the floor beside her bed. She thought about Judge Harlan Beale in his courtroom in Missouri, his black robe, his careful patience, his absolute certainty that no woman alone with a box of papers could outrun the reach of a man who owned the law in 3 territories. She reached down and touched the cold iron in the dark. Then she closed her eyes. She had $312 in a locked box in a room that faced east. That was enough to begin with. In the days that followed her arrival, Clara committed herself to learning the geography of the Holt household the way she had learned everything that mattered in her life by watching carefully before she moved. The house was not large, adobe walls, small windows, a kitchen that was genuinely the center of household life rather than a room for show. She had lived in a house in Abilene with 4 sitting rooms and a formal dining room and a kitchen she had been gently discouraged from entering. This was different in every particular. She found to her own surprise that the difference suited her. Gideon had built it himself, the original structure, and the additions with help from a Mexican carpenter named Tomas, who still came twice yearly for the roof. He had built it after the war in the way that certain men respond to catastrophe, not by breaking, but by pressing outward into new territory and making something with their hands. She was coming to understand that this was not incidental to his character. It was his character. He was a man who responded to destruction by building. She found this quietly easier to be near than the alternatives. The water situation was worse than she had initially understood. On her 4th day, while Gideon was mending fence on the north boundary, she spread the survey maps and claim documents across the kitchen table and worked through them with the methodical patience she had inherited from 20 years of watching her father pursue property disputes. What she found was there but quiet a date discrepancy in the easement, filing a survey marker appearing twice in the territorial register under slightly different coordinates and a marginal notation in the Callaway claim, written in a different hand from the rest of the document. Not proof of fraud, not yet, but a thread. She made her notes in her own hand, refolded the maps along their original creases, and returned them exactly as she had found them. She had learned the hard way that rushing with threads was how you turned them into knots. The evenings were the strangest part of those first days. After supper, Nora went to her room and Agnes departed. There were limits to the arrangement, and nighttime was one of them. And the house found its night configuration: Gideon at the far end of the kitchen table with the ranch accounts, or a journal he closed when she approached, and Clara with her own papers or correspondence, or simply nothing, sitting with chamomile tea and the sound of the desert and the lamp burning between them. They did not try to fill the silence. They sat in it. The silence was awkward for the first several evenings, and then it became less so. And by the end of the first week, it had settled into simply the particular quality of evenings in this house, two people occupying the same space without pretense. She noticed how he looked toward the door when the wind picked up. She noticed he always checked the water barrel before coming inside. She noticed the small, barely audible exhale he made when he was working through something difficult in his head. She noticed how he tracked her movements through the house and adjusted his own accordingly, giving her room without ceremony. She noticed he was doing the same thing with her. On the third day, when she came in from the corral with her skirt thoroughly muddied from a horse that had bumped her against the fence rail, he said nothing about the mud, nothing about whether she ought to be in the corral at all, and simply handed her a clean cloth with the matter-of-fact courtesy of a man who considers other people's business their own. That was when she began to think this might actually be workable. The town of Sweetwater Crossing she studied from the distance of supply runs, absorbing information from the conversations Gideon had at the feed store and the general store, building a map of the social geography, who owed whom, who had standing where the actual decisions were made versus where discussions were merely held. It was the same skill she had developed over 3 years in Abilene, and she thought sometimes about how strange it was that the most useful skill she had acquired from an unhappy marriage was the ability to read power in a room. Preston Beecham had not been a cruel man. He had never raised his hand. He had provided generously in every material sense. He had been interested in her intelligence, the way certain men of his station are interested in clever wives as distinguishing features, as accessories that reflect well on their owners. He had introduced her at dinner parties as "my wife who reads law." He said it the way another man might say "my wife who plays the piano beautifully." What he had not wanted was a wife who applied that reading to him. She had understood this around the second year of the marriage, and she had done what women in that position learned to do, found the narrow permitted channel and moved within it with the economy of someone navigating a space too small to turn around in. She had told herself this was reasonable. She had told herself all marriages required accommodation. And then Preston had given her the iron box and told her there wasn't much time, and she had understood that the accommodation had always been built on a foundation she had never been shown, and that the life she had arranged herself to fit had not been, after all, what she had been told it was. She had taken the box. She had converted what she could to cash. She had sewn the money into her coat and read advertisements in 3 different newspapers and written to Gideon Holt at Sweetwater Crossing because his advertisement was the most honest she had found. He didn't claim romance or devotion or the redemptive splendor of frontier life. He said a man with 40 acres and a daughter and a need for someone steady. She had thought she could be steady. The question she had not permitted herself in the urgent practicality of those weeks in Abilene was whether steady was going to be enough for her. She was beginning to suspect it was not. Not because the situation was insufficient, but because it was more than she had expected, and more was not something she had been allowing herself to want. On the 8th night, she heard Gideon's door close at the far end of the hall, and the sound of it, the ordinary domestic sound of a man going to bed, was so unlike the sound of Preston's door closing, which had always carried the quality of a verdict being handed down, that she felt something ease in her chest she hadn't known was tight. She reached down and touched the iron box in the dark. Tomorrow she would send a message to Santa Fe. The letter was already written. She had been careful with every word. 3 weeks, she thought, maybe 4. She closed her eyes and breathed the desert air, and outside the stars wheeled in their patient silence, and the windmill turned, and the horses shifted in the corral, and she slept. The first week taught her the rhythms of the Holt Ranch, the way she had learned most things through observation and studied restraint. She was dressed and in the kitchen. Before the stove was lit, coffee made by the time Gideon came in from the early barn chores. On the 3rd morning, he sat down across from her with his coffee and looked at her with the quiet recalibration she was beginning to recognize a man adjusting to a change in weather. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "I want something to do. I'm not ornamental." He looked down at his coffee. "My wife." He stopped. Then, as if he hadn't quite intended to say it, Grace, she didn't, the ranch wasn't what she'd expected. He left it there. Most things aren't, Clara said carefully. He didn't answer, but he didn't close the door on it either. What she was actually doing in those early mornings before anyone else was awake was the ranch accounts. Gideon had shown her the ledgers on the second day, not because he'd volunteered them, but because she had asked directly, and the directness had unsettled him into handing them over before he had thought through whether he wanted to. She had learned to rely on that particular effect. The ledgers were kept in a system that was technically coherent, but practically difficult. The accumulation of a man who was very good at running cattle and deeply uncomfortable with the paperwork required to run cattle. She spent 3 mornings reorganizing them without comment and left a revised summary on the table before he came in on the 4th morning. He picked it up, he read it, he went very still. "You found the Callaway discrepancy," he said. "There's a fence easement being claimed on the North Water access that predates your deed by 5 years," she said, pouring coffee. "But the date on the easement doesn't match the territorial survey register for that year. Someone filed a document they didn't have the right to file." He set the papers down and looked at her with a quality of attention that was different from anything he had given her before, closer to respect. She found to her slight surprise that this mattered to her. "Where did you learn to read territorial documents?" he said. "My husband was involved in a land matter in Abilene," she said carefully. "I learned enough to understand what I was looking at." He nodded slowly, and she could see him deciding not to press further. She was coming to understand a man who extended a fundamental courtesy that required nothing in return. He did not push through closed doors. It was the quality she trusted most in him, because it was the quality she had found rarest in men. Nora was a harder study. The girl had decided in the thorough way of intelligent children that Clara was an interesting problem. Not an enemy, a problem, something requiring serious study and careful conclusion. She tested consistently and observed constantly, and Clara had the sense of being evaluated by a small and very thorough committee of one. The horse was the first turning point. It happened on the 5th day. Clara was at the corral fence watching the horses. Useful, watching the kind that costs nothing and learns everything when she heard the wrong sound from the paddock. Her body understood before her mind did. She was over the fence before she'd consciously decided to move. Nora had been trying to saddle the gray, but something had startled him, and he'd shied sideways and knocked her down, and now he was circling in the tight, frightened way of a spooked horse, his hooves moving too close to a small body on the ground. Clara did not shout. She walked into the paddock with her hands loose at her sides and her voice low and even, words not mattering, only the tone. Slow, certain. The gray's head came toward her, and she put her hand on his neck and walked him in a wide, calm arc until he settled. Then she looked at Nora, who was sitting up in the dust with mud on her dress and her jaw set and her eyes very bright. "Are you hurt?" Clara asked. "No," Nora said, stubborn as a stone. "Good." Clara looked at the horse. "He spooks on the right side. You came at him from the wrong angle." Nora stood and brushed herself off with great dignity. "I know how to saddle a horse." "I know you do," Clara said, "but horses have bad days. You have to read them before you commit." A silence. "Are you going to tell my father?" Nora asked. Clara looked at her steadily. Nora's chin was up. She was braced for consequence, and the bracing was so familiar, that particular posture of a person who expects to be punished for an honest mistake, that something in Clara's chest constricted sharply. "No," she said. "It was an accident. You weren't hurt. I'd say the horse learned something too." Nora stared at her. Then Mrs. Pryor would have told him. "I'm not Mrs. Pryor," Clara said. Something changed in Nora's eyes. Not warmth yet, not enough for warmth, but the adjustment of a preliminary assessment, the beginning of a recalculation. They saddled the gray together. Clara stayed at his head and talked to him in Low German, which was her habit from childhood, and Nora worked with quiet competence. And when the horse stood calm and ready, Nora looked at her with something that might eventually become trust. "You talk to horses in German?" Nora asked. "Depending on the horse," Clara said. Nora laughed. It came out surprised, and she didn't quite know what to do with it. On the 8th day, the stranger came to Sweetwater Crossing. Clara almost missed him. She had ridden into town with Gideon for supplies, her first return since arrival, sitting on the wagon bench beside him in the cool morning. She had noticed how the town tracked them, the small, signifying glances of a community processing new information. She was becoming real to them. She was in the general store choosing thread when she saw him through the window. Medium height, medium build, tan coat hat at the right angle for covering his face. He was standing at the far end of the street examining the notice board, but he wasn't reading. His eyes quartered the street with the practiced efficiency of a man paid to locate things. She had seen him before. Not here. In Abilene, outside Preston's office on a Thursday afternoon in July, 3 weeks before Preston died. She set down the thread with great care and kept her face entirely still. He hadn't seen her yet. He was watching the saloon. She paid for what was in her basket, walked out and crossed to where Gideon was loading grain. "I need to go back," she said quietly. He looked at her. Something in her face had given something away because his went careful immediately. "All right," he said, "no questions, not yet." They were out of town in 10 minutes. She rode beside him in silence for the first mile, and then she said, "I need to tell you something. Not all of it yet, but enough." "Tell me what you need to," he said. She looked straight ahead at the red road. "My husband Preston Beecham died in May," she said. "The official verdict was cardiac arrest." She pressed her hand against the iron box in her lap. "It wasn't." Gideon said nothing. He kept his eyes on the road. He did not flinch, did not fill the silence, did not reach for any of the easy responses. He simply waited, and the waiting was its own form of steadiness. Preston had discovered that money was being diverted from a public land trust, she said. Significant money, the kind with serious consequences when it goes missing. Before he died, he gave me certain documents. He told me to keep them and be careful. She paused. 3 weeks after he died, I opened the box. "What was in it?" Gideon said. "Correspondence, financial records, names." She looked at the mesa. "The man responsible for the theft is Preston's brother-in-law, Judge Harlan Beale of the Missouri Circuit Court." Gideon was quiet long enough that she wondered if she'd made a serious error. "And you came here," he said finally, not accusatory, not even surprised, simply naming the truth. "I needed to go somewhere Harlan wouldn't look immediately. Somewhere I had a legitimate reason to be." She kept her voice level. "I was not expecting to find a household that needed more than a practical wife. I underestimated what I was walking into." "You were running," he said. "Yes," she said. Another quarter-mile of silence. She watched the road and calculated what she would do if he turned the wagon back toward town, if he told her to take her box and her secrets and find herself another arrangement. "The man in town," Gideon said, "a private investigator. I believe Harlan hired him." She paused. "He may not know exactly where I am yet, but if he's in Sweetwater Crossing, it won't take long." Gideon brought the wagon to a stop on a low rise. Below them, the ranch was visible, small and solid against the red earth. He looked at it for a long moment, then at her. "How dangerous is this?" he asked. She thought about Harlan Beale, about the way he had stood at Preston's funeral in his black suit, composed and certain, and looked at her across the open grave with the precise expression of a man registering that she might be a problem. The way that expression had shifted just slightly, just enough when she had held his gaze and not looked away. "Very," she said. He looked at the ranch again. "You should have told me this before you came," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I should have. But you didn't because you needed to go somewhere first and decide whether I was someone you could trust." She turned and looked at him. He was still watching the ranch below, his face showing nothing she could name, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. "Yes," she said. He picked up the reins. He clucked to the horses, and they started moving again down toward the buildings and the corral and the windmill turning in the wind. "Is there anything in that box that helps you?" he said. "Evidence that could be used. If it reached the right court, a federal court outside Harlan's jurisdiction?" "Yes." "How do you get it there?" "Very carefully," she said. He said nothing more until they reached the barn. When he helped her down from the wagon the first time he had touched her, a brief steadying grip on her arm, he held on one fraction of a second longer than necessary. Then he released her and led the horses inside without looking back. She stood in the yard and breathed. That evening, after Nora was in bed and Agnes had gone home, Gideon came to the kitchen table and sat across from her. He had the iron box in front of him. She had left it in her room. She had been careful with it for 6 months. She looked at it sitting on the table between them and understood with a cold clarity that she had left her door unlocked because she was not yet accustomed to having a door that locked. "I didn't open it," he said. She looked from the box to his face. He met her eyes directly, and his expression was not comfortable. It was the expression of a man confronting something about himself that he did not particularly like. "I went to fix the chair in your room," he said. "The leg's been loose since August. I picked the box up to move it, and I thought about opening it." He paused. "I didn't." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you told me something hard today," he said. "It seemed right to tell you something honest in return." He slid the box toward her side of the table. "This arrangement, whatever it might become, won't work if we don't tell each other the truth." She put her hand on the box. "My husband," she said slowly, "was the kind of man who said the right things and then told me very carefully what I was not permitted to do or say or know. He was not violent. He was simply a door that locked from the outside." She looked at the lamp flame. "I came here because I needed somewhere to breathe, and somewhere Harlan couldn't find me easily. I told myself that was practical, and that was enough." She met Gideon's eyes. "It was practical, but I am starting to think I might want something more than practical, and that frightens me considerably." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the desert was dark and patient. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," Gideon said. "Not yet." "No," she said. "I know." He looked at the box. "Is there anything I can do?" She thought about it because he deserved a real answer. "There's a federal attorney in Santa Fe," she said. "A man named Aldwell. He's the kind of man Harlan can't reach. If I could get a message to him, officially with documentation, it would matter." "I know a man who rides to Santa Fe twice monthly," Gideon said. "His name is Cisco. He's trustworthy." "Then that would help," she said. They sat at the kitchen table for another hour, talking carefully and honestly about practical things, the water rights, the investigator in town, what Harlan Beale was likely to do when he found her. Gideon listened completely the way she had almost forgotten people could listen without preparing his response while she was still talking. When she finally stood to go to bed, she took the iron box from the table. At the doorway, she paused. "Gideon," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name. She felt a small shift in the air between them. "Yes," he said. "Thank you for not opening it," she said. "It matters more than I can say." He looked at her steadily, and in the lamplight, his face was less guarded than she had yet seen it, the thing beneath the management showing itself in fragments. Not a man without feeling. A man who had taught himself to keep feeling at considerable distance for very good reasons, and who was perhaps, just perhaps, beginning to reconsider the policy. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow needs thinking through." She went down the hall to her east-facing room and set the box beside the bed and lay down in the dark. She thought I told him almost everything, and the walls did not close in. She had never told anyone anything and had the walls stay where they were. She was still thinking about this when she fell asleep. She did not sleep well that night, and she knew it was not Harlan that kept her awake. It was the box itself. Not its contents. She had long since made what peace she could with what was in it, had sorted and organized and annotated it until it was as useful as a collection of damning correspondence could possibly be made. It was the fact of it sitting on Gideon Holt's kitchen table and the lamplight present between them, like a third person at a dinner neither of them had planned. The fact that she had told him as much as she had. She had told a lawyer in Topeka transactional calculated. She had told no one else. Not in Abilene during those urgent weeks of preparation, not in the letter she had written to Gideon's advertisement, which had offered him her practical qualities and said nothing about the rest. She had told him because she had seen the investigator through the general store window, and the world had narrowed to the dimensions of an immediate problem, and telling Gideon had been part of solving it. That was what she told herself. But she also knew she had told him because watching him read those survey documents, watching him register the discrepancies she'd found, and look at her with actual respect, the respect given to something worth respecting, she had felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years of marriage to a man who called her exceptional while ensuring she remained exceptional only in ways that served him. The sense of being seen by someone who was looking at what was actually there. This was dangerous. She had cataloged it and was keeping it at careful distance. She turned over in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling. She thought about what he'd said on the wagon road. When she'd finished explaining, he had said, "But you didn't because you needed to go somewhere first and decide whether I was someone you could trust." Not a question, a naming. and it had caught her breath because she had not been able to name it herself. And here was a man she'd known for 8 days who had named it without being asked. She pressed her hand against the iron box beside the bed. In the morning, she would be practical. Morning was when the work was manageable. It was only at night, when the work was finished and the house was quiet, that she could feel the shape of everything she was not letting herself want. She listened to the desert. The insects had gone quiet with the cold, and there was only the wind off the Cimarron Ridge, and the horses shifting in the corral, and the windmill turning with its patient monotony. She had grown up in Kansas and thought she knew what large meant. She understood now that she had only known wide. This country was large in a different direction, downward into time, into rock, into something that had existed before every person alive, and would exist after all of them. And in that depth, her own urgencies felt, if not small, at least proportionate. She was beginning, against her intentions, to find this comforting. The days that followed had a quality she did not have precise words for, the quality of two people engaged in the genuine process of knowing each other, neither hurrying it nor holding it back, simply letting it accumulate the way sediment accumulates almost imperceptibly until one day you realize the landscape has changed. She learned that Gideon made a specific expression when something in the accounts was wrong, a slight narrowing around the eyes, a barely perceptible tightening at one corner of his mouth. She learned that Nora hummed while she worked, never the same melody twice, always something incomplete, and that Gideon always looked toward the sound when he heard it the way a man looks toward a fire unconsciously because the fire is warm. She learned that he made coffee too strong because he had lived alone with his own preferences for 5 years, and she learned this on the third morning and said nothing about it and simply made the coffee herself on the fourth morning, slightly less strong, and he drank it without comment. That was something. She learned the small archaeology of the house itself, the way the third step from the bottom groaned differently depending on the weather, the way the kitchen window faced exactly north so that at midday the room was at its most shadowless and plain. The jar of coffee beans kept on the second shelf rather than the first. She understood this. Eventually, Nora had knocked the first shelf jar down twice, and so the beans had been relocated without announcement. This small accommodation made without drama told her more about who he was than many larger things. She was thinking about the particular simplicity of a man who reorganizes his kitchen without making it anyone's problem, when she found him in the barn one afternoon sitting on a hay bale with a letter in his hand and his face showing the look of someone who has received news that doesn't surprise him but lands hard regardless. "What is it?" she said. He held the letter out. She took it and read. It was from the Callaway Land Syndicate's attorney, precisely worded, professionally courteous, the kind of letter that smiles on its face and holds a knife behind its back. It informed Gideon Holt that in light of the territorial court's ruling on the Cimarron water rights, the syndicate intended to exercise its easement claims on the North Spring access, effective the 1st of January. This would require him to reroute his primary irrigation at his own expense, a cost the letter acknowledged was significant and expressed sympathy for, with the particular insincerity of a document drafted by someone who had never felt sympathy for anything they couldn't profit from. "When did this come?" she said. "Today," he said. She read it again, more slowly, the way her father had taught her to read any document claiming authority, looking not for what it said, but for what it assumed you wouldn't notice. "This is the document I found the discrepancy in," she said. "The date on the easement filing doesn't match the territorial register from that year." "I know," he said, "but knowing isn't proving, and the court has already ruled." "Which court?" He looked at her. "Circuit," he said. The cold clarity she'd felt looking through the general store window settled through her again. "Harlan's jurisdiction extends to New Mexico territory," she said. "As of 5 months ago," Gideon said, "the expansion was granted quietly. I didn't know about it until Dunbar mentioned it last week, sideways, not looking me in the eye, the way a man mentions something he's uncomfortable knowing." "Dunbar knows more than he's said," she said. "He's been backing Callaway's water claims for 2 years," Gideon said. "I thought it was politics. The syndicate has money, money has influence. But if Harlan expanded his circuit jurisdiction specifically to cover this territory 5 months before the Callaway ruling came down, then it wasn't politics," she said. "It was arrangement." They looked at each other in the barn. Afternoon light came through the gaps in the planks. Outside, the wind had picked up off the mesa with the dry, restless sound she was coming to associate with an approaching weather change. Gideon, she said, is the date on this ruling before or after the discrepancy date I found in the easement filing? He frowned. After. Then the court ruled on a document that was already demonstrably altered, she said, which means the ruling is based on fraud, which is exactly the kind of thing that would interest a federal court. And it connects your water rights case directly to everything else in the box. He was quiet for a moment. He set the letter on the hay bale and looked at it with the careful, methodical attention of a man who builds before he acts. You think Harlan is involved in this, he said, not just because of you, because of the water. I think Harlan goes where his interests require him to go, she said. And I think this water rights case became his interest the moment someone with enough money offered him something for it. She handed the letter back. This is actually useful, Gideon. It doesn't feel useful, he said. No, but it connects things. It gives the federal attorney a second line of evidence that doesn't run only through Missouri. It means the case has a local dimension that this territory will actually care about separately from anything involving Preston. She paused. And it means Harlan's reach into this territory is itself part of the pattern, which makes the pattern larger and harder to dismiss. He looked at the letter. You're doing it again, he said. Doing what? Finding the angle that makes things workable, he said, even the bad things. He said it not as criticism, but as careful observation, a man noting something he valued and was uncertain how to say directly. I mean to say I find it useful, to be near. He stopped as though the words had come out slightly differently than he'd shaped them and looked away. She did not make anything of it. She was learning his grammar, a man who sometimes approached the true statement sideways by way of the approximate one, and trusted you to be paying attention. She was paying very careful attention. October turned toward November. The light over the Cimarron Ridge went lower and sharper. The air in the mornings took on the high desert cold that was clean and knife-edged rather than damp. She had not known there were so many kinds of cold. She rode out with Gideon most mornings now. This had not been formally arranged, it had accumulated. One morning she appeared at the barn, and he saddled a horse, and the next morning she appeared and he saddled a horse, and by the third morning it was simply what happened without needing to be named. They rode the fence lines and the ridge approaches, and he explained the land as they went, not instructing exactly more the way a man talks about something he loves in the presence of someone who is clearly listening. He showed her where the winter water ran from the snowmelt and where it pooled before it reached the spring that fed the north pasture. He showed her the section of fence where posts had to be replaced every 2 years because something in the soil composition accelerated the rot, a fact discovered through expensive trial and error over 11 years and now accepted as simply part of the nature of the place. He showed her the flat of good grass at the base of the North Ridge, the meadow she had not yet seen, and said only that it was the best ground on the property and that he hadn't been able to use it properly because of the water dispute. 9 years, she thought. 9 years farming around a constraint that was fraudulently imposed. 9 years adjusting and compensating and working harder than he should have needed to because a man in a courtroom had needed to extend his reach and found a willing partner. He showed her on one of those morning rides the place where the old adobe walls of the original homestead still stood, not his building, but the building before his left by someone who had come before and not stayed. 3 walls and no roof, the desert reclaiming it inch by inch, juniper growing through the window openings. He said nothing about it, and she said nothing about it, and she thought about all the people who had looked at this country and tried to make a life in it and failed, and how the country simply absorbed the evidence of their failure into itself, and how Gideon Holt was still here after 11 years. This, too, told her something. On the morning she didn't ride, she worked at the kitchen table with the survey maps and documents. She had written to her contact in Topeka Birch, her father's former colleague, the only person in Kansas she trusted entirely, confirming the chain of custody for the original documents she'd sent before leaving Abilene. She had written to Aldwell a second time through Cisco, expanding what he knew about the Callaway connection and its relationship to the Beale jurisdiction expansion. She was building the structure of the case, the way her father had taught her to read a survey from the outside edges, inward, establishing the boundary before attempting the interior. The territorial documents were in better order than she'd initially realized. The discrepancy she'd found was not alone. It had she was coming to see a family. 3 other filings in the Callaway case had similarly mismatched dates, suggesting not a single clerical error, but a pattern of deliberate alteration. She made her notes in a separate ledger she kept locked in her traveling bag, written in her father's surveying shorthand, which she had learned as a child and which no one else she had ever met could read fluently. Her father had taught it to her, saying the most useful knowledge is the kind that belongs only to you until you choose to share it. She was choosing carefully. The town of Sweetwater Crossing she studied from the distance of supply runs, building a map of the social geography, who owed whom, who had standing, where the actual decisions were made versus where discussions were merely held. Turner ran the feed store and was related by marriage to Dunbar the sheriff. The pastor at the Leaning Steeple Church had been here longer than most and knew things he didn't say. Mrs. Garrity at the general store knew everything and said most of it, which made her valuable in ways she didn't intend. Clara filed all of this. Knowledge of that kind was its own form of currency, and she had learned the hard way never to arrive at a situation with empty pockets. The evenings had settled into a rhythm she had not planned for and found she did not want to disturb. After supper, Nora went to her room and Agnes departed, and the house became its night configuration. Gideon at the far end of the table with the ranch accounts, and Clara with her papers or her correspondence, or simply nothing, sitting with chamomile tea and the sound of the desert outside. They did not try to fill the silence. They sat in it. The silence was awkward for the first several evenings, and then it became less so. And by the end of the first week, it had settled into simply the particular quality of evenings in this house. Two people occupying the same space without pretense. She noticed how he looked toward the door when the wind picked up. She noticed he always checked the water barrel before coming inside at night. She noticed how he tracked her movements through the house and adjusted his own accordingly, giving her room without ceremony. On the third day, when she came in from the corral with her skirt thoroughly muddied from a horse that had bumped her against the fence rail, he said nothing about the mud and simply handed her a clean cloth with the matter-of-fact courtesy of a man who considers other people's business their own. On the fifth day, when she was up before dawn working and he came in for the early chores, he went around her without comment, put on the kettle, and left a second cup on the table beside her papers on his way out. He did not ask if she wanted it, he simply left it. Small things, the kind that don't announce themselves. That was when she began to think this might actually be workable. She was in the kitchen one afternoon working through the territorial survey register when Nora came home from school and dropped her bag on the chair with the decisive thud of a child who has been carrying something heavier than books. Mrs. Greer said the answer was wrong, Nora announced. She said it with the flat, precise indignation of someone who has been given an incorrect verdict and has not yet decided what to do with it. Clara looked up. What was the question? She asked what the most important thing a woman could do for her community was. Nora's jaw was set in the manner Clara had come to recognize as the approach to a principled position. I said, make sure the legal documents are in order. She said the answer was raise her children well and support her husband's work. Clara set down her pen. What do you think of her answer? She said. I think she gave the answer that wouldn't get her in trouble, Nora said. I think she knows that's not the real answer. Clara looked at her for a moment. What makes you think that? She said. Because Mrs. Greer checks the legal notices in the paper every week before she reads anything else. I've seen her. My father says she owns the boarding house in her own name and has 3 mortgages she manages herself. Nora paused. She knows what the important things are. She just doesn't say so. Clara looked at this child with her serious face and her 10 years of born knowledge. You're right, Clara said, on both counts. Nora considered this as a confirmation rather than a revelation and went to wash her hands because supper needed doing, and Nora, unlike her father, did not wait to be asked. On the 10th evening, Gideon pushed back from the table and said without preamble, I want to tell you something about the water dispute, something I haven't told anyone because it makes me look foolish. She put down her pen. All right. When the Callaway ruling came down 18 months ago, I had a lawyer, fellow in Santa Fe recommended by a man I trust. I paid him what he asked, and he told me the case was sound and we'd win on appeal. He paused. We didn't. He filed the appeal and then wrote to tell me it had been denied, that further action would be expensive and unlikely to succeed. He looked at his hands. What I found out later from Dunbar, of all people, was that the lawyer never filed a proper appeal. He filed something, but it was incomplete. Missing documentation. Poorly argued. He paused. Dunbar said the lawyer had connections to the Callaway Syndicate's legal team, that the Santa Fe representation had been arranged before he ever came to me. Clara looked at him. You paid a man who was already bought, she said. Yes. He said it without self-pity, but without ease. I trusted a recommendation and didn't check. That's not like me. I check everything on this ranch twice. I let the urgency of the situation make me careless. Harlan does that to people, she said. He creates urgency so you don't check. The urgency is part of the method. You sound like you've thought about this, he said. 6 months, and she said, he does it in courtrooms and in offices and in families. He creates a version of events that feels too urgent to question, and by the time you think to question it, the filing has been submitted and the ruling has come down and the paperwork says what he needed it to say. The urgency is the weapon. Everything else is just procedure. He was quiet. Is that what he did to Preston? He said. She thought about this. Preston was different. Preston had the inside view. He knew what Harlan was doing because he was close enough to see it. The urgency Harlan used on Preston was personal urgency, the urgency of a family secret, the urgency of knowing something dangerous and not knowing what to do about it. She looked at the table. Preston sat on it too long. He was trying to decide what he owed and what it would cost and whether there was a version of the situation where he could come out with clean hands. There wasn't. There never is. And you, she looked up at him. I had 3 weeks, she said, from the moment I opened the box to the moment I left Abilene. I did not try to find a version with clean hands. I tried to find a version that was survivable. They're not always the same thing. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight. Are they the same here? He asked. She considered the question honestly. I think they might be, she said. That's what I'm working toward. Agnes Pryor came every morning and left after supper, and the three-person arrangement had achieved a kind of uneasy equilibrium. Agnes was intelligent and had arrived at some private reckoning with the situation that made her less combative than she might have been. The small domestic additions she still brought felt less like territorial claims now, and more like what they actually were, the habits of a woman reorganizing herself around a new understanding. Slowly, with dignity, without making it anyone else's problem. It would have been simpler if Agnes were petty. Instead, she was genuinely good patient with Nora, honest in her opinions, when Gideon asked for them, capable of maintaining grace under circumstances that would have justified a great deal less grace. Clara found herself against her inclinations respecting this. She understood the particular economy of what Agnes had been doing here, the pressed curtains and the good coffee, and the specific timing of her departures. The calculation underneath the grace. Clara had done the same thing in Abilene in a different context for different reasons. She was not going to hold it against her. One afternoon in late October, while Gideon was on the north pasture and Nora was at school, Agnes came in and sat down across from Clara without her usual purposeful efficiency. I want to say something, Agnes said. Clara put down her pen. All right. I'm not stupid, Agnes said. I know what's happening here. I knew the moment you walked across that yard. She paused. I've been telling myself for 10 months that what Gideon and I had was something. And maybe it was. But it wasn't what he needed, I knew that. I was hoping it would become what he needed if I gave it enough time. She looked at her hands. I think you should know that I'm not going to fight for something that wasn't mine to claim. Agnes. I'm not asking for anything, Agnes said. I'm not asking you to be grateful or kind or any particular way. I'm saying it plainly so it doesn't have to be said in pieces later. She met Clara's eyes. He's a good man. Nora is a good girl. This is a good place. Don't waste it. Clara held her gaze for a long moment. I don't intend to, she said. Agnes picked up her basket and went back to the stove, and neither of them mentioned the conversation again, and things were not quite the same afterward, but they were in some way that resisted simple description easier. The investigator had not been visible in Sweetwater Crossing for 4 days. This worried Clara more than his presence had. She did what she could do. She sent another letter to Birch and Topeka confirming the copies were secure. She sent a brief note to Hester in Kansas City, asking only for information about Harlan's recent movements, framed as a social inquiry. She counted the days until Cisco's next ride to Santa Fe. She ran through the calculations again. How long it would take Aldwell to review what she'd sent. How long for a federal warrant to be prepared. How long before any form of protection could be put in place. 3 weeks, she thought, maybe 4. She had survived worse waits. And then the second stranger came to town. She was at the general store on a Thursday morning, choosing thread and trying to look like someone who was only choosing thread when she became aware of a woman she had not seen in Sweetwater Crossing before. She was perhaps 42, fair-haired with a traveling coat that had been well used, and the particular quality of awareness in her movements that Clara recognized from her own mirror, the specific calibrated alertness of a person who is watching for something without wanting to appear to watch. Their eyes met once briefly across the dry goods counter. The woman's gaze was steady and measured and not accidental. Clara paid for her thread. She went back to the wagon. She told Gideon quietly that there was a woman in town she didn't recognize. All right, he said, cautious. She wasn't passing through, Clara said. She was looking for someone. You up a mow? I don't know, maybe. She pressed her hand against the iron box in her lap. There's something I haven't told you, something about Preston's family. He waited as he always waited, completely without impatience. Preston had a younger brother, she said. Dalton. He was declared dead in the war, killed at Kennesaw Mountain, according to Harlan in the official record. But 3 weeks before Preston died, he received a letter he said was about Harlan. He said it changed everything he thought he knew. He said he needed time to decide what to do. She looked at the road. He didn't have time. And I've been wondering since I opened the box whether Dalton actually died at Kennesaw Mountain. Whether he survived and has been watching Harlan from somewhere safe. Whether he is, in fact, the person who could corroborate everything in the box from the outside. Gideon drove in silence for a mile. And you think the woman might be connected to him, he said. I don't know. It could be coincidence. She paused, but she looked at me like she already knew who I was. Not like she was deciding like she'd already decided. What do you want to do? Nothing today, she said. I want to see if she's still here tomorrow. She was. On Friday morning, the woman was sitting on the boarding house porch when Clara rode past. She looked up when she heard the horse. This time she made no pretense. She held Clara's gaze with the calm, direct attention of someone who has made a decision and is prepared to act on it. Clara dismounted. She tied her horse to the rail. She walked up the steps. I'm Clara Beecham, she said. The woman studied her, taking her measure in the unhurried way Gideon had looked at her on her first evening, the serious assessment of someone deciding whether reality matches preparation. I know who you are, the woman said. My name is Vera Marsh. I write for the Albuquerque Courier. A pause. I knew Dalton Beecham. Clara sat down in the chair across from her. Tell me, she said. Vera Marsh told it methodically in the order it had happened without embellishment. Dalton Beecham had not died at Kennesaw Mountain. He had been badly wounded and left for dead, and he had survived as men sometimes do, who have more stubbornness than sense, and something unfinished keeping them in the world. He had spent 14 months recovering in a farmhouse in northern Georgia, tended by a family who helped him for no reason, except that he was a human being and badly hurt. By the time he could travel and communicate his survival, Harlan had been declared his legal heir, and Dalton's name had been removed from everything official that a living person's name appears on. He came west, Vera said, to Albuquerque 4 years ago. He had been surviving quietly for 2 years at that point, staying below the surface out of Harlan's sight. He knew by then what Harlan had done, what Harlan was still doing. He had been gathering for years, not formally, but gathering letters, financial records, the testimony of men who had dealt with Harlan and found the dealing costly. Her voice remained level and even. He contacted me because he needed someone with access to print and someone who could move through the territory without attracting attention that would get back to Harlan. We worked together for 3 years. And Preston, Clara said. Dalton found Preston 8 months before Preston died. He traced him through the Abilene Bar Association. He wrote carefully, not knowing whether Preston knew what Harlan had done or was part of it. She paused. Preston wrote back. He confirmed that he had known for some time that the trust fund administration was irregular, had been watching it quietly without knowing what to do. Dalton's letter showed him the full scope, a pause that contained something careful. He also confirmed that he had a wife. He said she was capable. He said if anything happened and if there were materials to be preserved, she would know what to do with them. Clara sat with this for a moment. He said that, she said, yes. She looked at her hands. He had said she was capable. He had said it to a brother he hadn't spoken to in 15 years before coming home and pressing a box into her hands without explanation. He had said it apparently with more confidence than he had ever shown her directly. She thought about this. She thought about a man who had made her world smaller and had known he was making it smaller and who had at the end done the only thing he could think of to make it larger again. She thought about whether that was enough. She thought it was not enough. She thought it was also not nothing. And after Preston died, she said, Dalton died 14 months ago, Vera said, with the careful evenness of someone who has processed a grief and still carries its shape. Cholera in Albuquerque. There was an outbreak. She looked at the street. Before he died, he gave me everything he'd gathered. All of it. He told me that Preston's wife had a box of materials that she had left Abilene, that if she reached out or if I found her, the two collections together would be what was needed. She looked at Clara. And then Harlan's investigator appeared in Sweetwater Crossing, and my source here sent me a message, and I came. Who is your source? Clara asked. Vera almost smiled. Okafor at the livery. He's been watching this town for me for 2 years. Clara thought about the broad, silent liveryman who had asked her no questions and had her moving within 20 minutes of her arrival. She filed this new understanding of him with the calm of someone who has learned not to show surprise at how the pieces fit. She thought about Dalton, a man she had never met, a man who had survived a battlefield by sheer stubbornness, and then spent 3 years gathering evidence in a territory where he officially did not exist, building a case he might never live to use, trusting that someone somewhere would finish what he started. He had been right about Preston. He had been right about her. She found sitting on the boarding house porch with the cold morning air and her iron box in her mind that she wanted to be worthy of having been trusted by a man she would never meet. What do you need from me? She asked. What's in the box? Vera said. Not to publish, not yet. I want to see whether what Dalton gathered and what Preston gathered say the same things. If the financial records match, if the names are the same, if the dates align. She paused. I have a contact at the federal circuit, a judge who is not in Harlan's pocket. If your evidence and Dalton's together go to Aldwell in Santa Fe with that judge's name attached, Aldwell will move. I already have materials with Aldwell, Clara said. I know, Vera said. I'm saying they'll be enough. The two sets together will be enough. She looked at Clara steadily. This is the case Dalton spent 3 years building. It is the case your husband died before he could make. They both gave what they had to give. I think it's time to finish it. Clara sat on the boarding house porch in the cold October morning and thought about two dead men. Preston Beecham, who had given her a box and an apology in the same act, and Dalton Beecham, who had survived Kennesaw Mountain and come west and gathered and died of cholera with his case still open. And she thought about what it meant to be the person holding the thread that finished what they couldn't. I need to speak with someone first, she said. I need a day. Vera nodded. I'll be here. She rode back to the ranch and found Gideon mending the corral gate in the cold morning. She told him everything Vera had said standing with the gate between them, and he listened until she was finished before he spoke. Do you trust her? He said. I trust that she has her own reasons that align with mine, she said. That's not the same as trust, but it's a workable foundation. She paused. I want to compare what's in the box with what she has. If it aligns and if the same names and payments and dates appear in both sets, then Dalton Beecham spent 3 years gathering from the outside what Preston gathered from the inside, two independent sources reaching the same conclusion. Aldwell can move on that. Gideon fixed the gate latch, clicked it shut, and turned to face her fully. He was in his work coat hat, pushed back on his head, hands calloused and still at his sides. What do you need from me, Ashton? He said. I need you to ride to town and see Dunbar, she said. Not to tell him everything. Enough to know where he stands. Enough to give him the information he needs to make a decision when the time comes. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. And tonight? Tonight I'm going through the box again, she said. Everything in it in order with fresh eyes, because tomorrow I'm going to open it in front of someone I've known for less than a day, and I need to be sure of every page before I do that. He looked at her for a moment. Clara, he said, yes. This is the right thing, he said. I know you know that already. I'm saying it anyway because sometimes it helps to hear it from outside your own head. She looked at him, at the weathered, careful face of a man who was not eloquent and who was nonetheless saying exactly what needed to be said. Yes, she said, it helps. He picked up his tools. She went inside. That night she lay in the east-facing room and thought about what tomorrow required. She had been carrying the box for 6 months. She had carried it through the last weeks in Abilene when she was afraid to leave the house and on the train west and into a household she did not know. And through 3 weeks of learning this land and these people and this strange, large, red-earthed country, the box had been the weight at the center of everything, the thing she was protecting, the thing she was running from, the thing she was moving toward, some resolution she could not yet fully see. Tomorrow she would open it in front of Vera Marsh. She would share the burden of it, which was also the power of it, which was also the thing she had been most afraid to do. She reached down and touched the cold iron in the dark. She thought about Dalton Beecham surviving Kennesaw Mountain on stubbornness alone. She thought about Preston pressing the box into her hands in April and being right about the time. She thought about what it meant to finish something on behalf of people who could not finish it themselves. She kept her hand on the box. She closed her eyes. She slept. The next morning, Clara sat at the kitchen table with Vera Marsh and opened the iron box for the first time in another person's presence. Her hands were steady. She had trained them to be steady. It was one of the first things she had trained herself to do after April, after Preston had pressed the box into her hands and she had stood in the hallway of their fine Abilene house and understood all at once that the life she was living had been built on a foundation she had never been permitted to see. Her hands had shaken then. She had trained them out of it. Trembling was information, and she had already given too much information to too many people for too long. She laid the contents on the kitchen table one item at a time in the order she had established: correspondence first, then financial records, then the official documents with Preston's annotations, and finally the sealed envelope he had marked private. She had not opened the sealed envelope. She had carried it for 6 months without opening it, because opening it felt like a kind of ending she was not ready for. She opened it now with Vera across the table and Gideon standing at the kitchen doorway. It was a letter, 4 pages in Preston's careful attorney's hand dated 3 weeks before his death. She read it slowly. He had known he wrote for approximately 2 months before he died since the letter from Dalton. He had known that Harlan had orchestrated the theft of the public trust funds, had manipulated territorial court appointments, and had been systematically eliminating anyone who could testify to what he'd done. He had known he wrote that he himself was in danger. He had known and he had been afraid, and he had not known what to do with the fear. And while he was deciding, the time had run out. He had also written this: I know I was not the husband you deserved. I know I made your world smaller than it should have been. I am sorry for this in ways I do not have the skill to adequately express. I am giving you the box because you are the most capable person I know, and because I do not know anyone else I can trust with it. I hope it gives you something useful. I hope it gives you freedom. She folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. Vera was watching her. He knew, Clara said. Moesha. Yes, Vera said gently. He knew about Dalton, about the land trust, about all of it. Yes. Clara looked at her hands on the table for a long moment. Something was moving through her that she didn't have a name for, not grief exactly, not anger exactly, but something that encompassed both and extended beyond them into the specific difficult feeling of understanding a person for the first time after they were no longer present to be understood. He had known and he had not told her. He had managed her the same way he managed everything, by determining what she needed to know and withholding the rest right up until the moment he couldn't anymore. And then at the end, he had given her the one thing he had that was worth giving and called her capable and called it his best guess at an apology. She thought about that. She thought about a man who had made her world smaller and had been ashamed of it. She thought about whether what he had given her at the end was enough. She thought it was not enough. She thought it was also not nothing. She thought that some things could be both insufficient and real at the same time, and that the real part didn't cancel the insufficient part, and neither did the insufficient part cancel the real part, and that living with that particular mathematics was simply part of what it meant to have loved someone imperfectly and lost them. She looked up. Let's compare documents, she said, but the letter stayed with her all morning underneath the work. She was good at containing things. She had spent 3 years becoming good at it, but containing something and dismissing it were different operations, and she did not dismiss the letter. She let it run alongside the document, work the way a river runs alongside a road's separate parallel present. She had married Preston Beecham because he was intelligent, and because he had, when he chose to use it, a quality of attention that made her feel seen. She had learned over 3 years that the attention was selective, that what he chose to illuminate in her was the part that confirmed what he already believed, and what he chose not to see was the part that contradicted it. He had wanted a particular kind of wife, and he had believed she was that wife, and when she turned out to be more than that, he had managed the excess the way he managed everything, by routing it into uses he could control. She had not hated him for it. She had not even for most of the marriage recognized it clearly enough to name. It was only afterward, only in the Abilene house with the door closed and the box in her hands and the letter in her lap, that she had seen the full shape of it. The world made smaller, the doors narrowed. The slow, almost imperceptible contraction of what she was permitted to know and want and choose. He had known it was a contraction. He had said so in 4 careful pages. He had been ashamed. She had carried the letter for 6 months, trying to decide what to do with the shame. Not his shame, hers. The specific, difficult shame of having loved someone who diminished her and not having seen it until the end of having organized her life around a person and a world that were both smaller than what she deserved, and not having known, truly not having known, until she was standing in a hallway in Abilene with an iron box and no house to return to. She thought about that. She thought about whether understanding was a comfort or whether it only clarified the cost. She thought it did both. She thought that was probably what understanding always does. It makes the thing real in a way that is both better and harder than not knowing. And then she set it aside because the documents were waiting and Vera was across the table, and 2 days was a very specific amount of time. They worked for 3 hours. Vera spread Dalton Beecham's materials across the table, and Clara spread hers, and they went through them methodically. Vera reading entries from Dalton's records while Clara checked them against Preston's, and then Clara reading from Preston's while Vera checked against Dalton's. The financial records matched. The names were the same. The dates aligned. Not approximately, precisely. The payment amounts that appeared in Harlan's correspondence and Preston's collection appeared in the financial records Dalton had obtained from the Callaway Syndicate's former bookkeeper, a man who had left the company under contested circumstances and who had been willing in exchange for Dalton's help relocating to California to provide a full accounting of what had passed through the company's accounts. The payments to Harlan were documented from both directions, the outgoing transfer from the Callaway accounts and the incoming receipt from Harlan's own records. There was no interpretation required. The evidence simply stated what it was. She had not let herself see how careful Preston had been until she saw it reflected in Dalton's parallel work. Preston had annotated everything, dates, relationships between documents, the chain of custody for each piece of correspondence. He had worked in the precise, quietly obsessive manner of a man who understood that a case built on incomplete records is worse than no case at all, because it gives the opposing counsel a surface to attack. He had been afraid he had written, and while he was deciding what to do with the fear, the time had run out. But the work itself did not show the fear. The work was meticulous. The work was, she thought, the most honest thing he had ever given her. Not the letter at the end, not the apology in 4 careful pages, but the months of precise, frightened work that he had done when he must have known he was running out of time. She did not say this out loud. She filed it in the place where she kept things that were true and not yet finished becoming clear. Dalton's materials showed a different methodology. The journalist's instinct, the accumulation of sources rather than documents. He had letters from 3 separate witnesses to conversations they'd overheard between Harlan and the Callaway representatives. He had a sworn statement from the bookkeeper, whom he had apparently located through a network of contacts across 2 territories, that he had built over 7 years of ostensible non-existence. 7 years of moving quietly through places where no one was expecting a man who officially wasn't there. He had a copy of the original Holt grant from 1871, obtained from the Territorial Land Office, and annotated in his own hand with the specific fraudulent alterations made to the Callaway easement filing. The alterations were not subtle. He had circled them in red ink. Looking at those circles, Clara understood that Dalton had not been subtle by choice. He had been careful because careful was what the situation required. And he had finally reached the point where he could be plain, and the circled alterations were a kind of plainness. Here they said, "Look here. This is the lie, and I am done speaking around it." What Dalton Beecham had gathered from the outside and what Preston Beecham had gathered from the inside were 2 halves of the same picture, and together they were overwhelming. Clara had known this was likely. She had believed it was likely, Belief and proof are different in kind, not merely degree, and sitting at the table looking at two independent collections of documents that said the same things in the same numbers with the same names. That was proof. It had a different quality from belief. It landed differently in the chest. Vera sat back and looked at what they had assembled between them. "This is enough," she said. "This is more than enough." Clara looked at the documents on the table. "Then we need to get it to Aldwell," she said, "before Harlan gets here." "He's already closer than you think," Vera said. Clara looked at her. "My source in Kansas City sent word yesterday morning," Vera said. "Harlan left on a train 3 days ago. He has 2 men with him, not investigators this time." She paused. "He'll be in Sweetwater Crossing by Saturday." Today was Thursday. Clara pressed her hands flat on the table. "Then we have 2 days," she said. She said it calmly. She let the deadline become concrete and let it settle through her and become a tool rather than a fear. 2 days. She knew what 2 days could contain and what they couldn't, and she knew which category each necessary action fell into. "What can you do from here?" she asked Vera. "I can write the narrative document today," Vera said. "The organized summary of the combined evidence dates names, amounts, the full chain of the Callaway connection to the Beale jurisdiction expansion. Something Aldwell can read in an hour and understand in full." She paused. "I can also send a message to my contact at the Federal Circuit. If he receives confirmation from me directly that the evidence is what I've told him it is, he will put pressure on Aldwell to move before Harlan's Washington lawyers can file any blocking motions." "Then do both," Clara said. "Today." Vera nodded. "And you, boy?" "I need to get a complete second set of copies to Cisco and on his way to Santa Fe today," Clara said. "Not just what I've already sent. Everything, including Dalton's materials. Both sets together with the cross-reference I'll write this afternoon." She paused. "And I need to talk to Gideon about Dunbar." She and Gideon talked that night for 2 hours after Nora was in bed. He had a directness in these conversations that she had come to rely on. He didn't dress things up, didn't avoid the hard calculations, didn't pretend the situation was less serious than it was. She had come to understand a man who had learned to be precise about practical things because the frontier did not forgive imprecision. You checked the fence or the cattle suffered. You read the weather signs or you were caught in the open. The same quality that made him an honest partner in the work, made him an honest partner in this. "Dunbar," he said, meaning the county sheriff. "He's been cooperative with Callaway, which means he's probably cooperative with Harlan. Can he be worked around?" "Depends on what Harlan brings," Gideon said. "A federal warrant from Aldwell outranks anything Dunbar has. But if Harlan arrives before Aldwell moves, Dunbar could use the time against us." "How much time does Dunbar give us if we approach him directly?" she said. Gideon thought about this. "Dunbar's not stupid. He knows the Callaway easement documentation is shaky. I've been making noise about it for months. If Harlan shows up and the case against him is already in federal hands, Dunbar won't want to be on the wrong side of that." "Then we tell Dunbar," she said. "Not everything. Enough." Gideon looked at her. "You'd trust Dunbar with enough?" "I'd trust his self-interest with enough," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had learned was his version of a smile, not the movement of his mouth, but something in his eyes. A brief warmth there and then managed away. "All right," he said. "We tell Dunbar enough." "Something else," she said. "When Harlan comes, and he will all come, I want you to know what I'll do." He looked at her steadily. "If the warrant has arrived, we use it," she said. "Dunbar won't stop us. The evidence is already in Santa Fe. Harlan can posture, but he can't reach a federal filing." She paused. "If the warrant hasn't arrived, if Aldwell moves too slowly, or Harlan's lawyers file something to delay it, I need you to understand that I won't let him use this ranch as a bargaining chip. I won't let him threaten the water rights or Nora's safety to pressure me." "Meaning," Gideon said. "Meaning if it comes to it, I'll meet him when in town on neutral ground. I'll face him there and I'll tell him directly that everything is already in Aldwell's hands and the only thing left is for the process to complete. That there is nothing he can do to me that will undo what's already been done." She looked at the table. "I'd rather that conversation happen in Sweetwater Crossing than on your property." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That's not going to happen," he said. "Gideon. I mean, he's not going to get within talking distance of you without me present." he said. That's not a debate I'm willing to have. He paused. I understand what you're doing. You're managing the situation. You're finding the angle. I've watched you do it for 3 weeks, and I think it's one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen a person do. He paused. But there are situations where finding the angle means you end up carrying everything yourself. And I'm not going to let that happen. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. I'm not used to that, she said. I know, he said. I'm telling you anyway. She looked at him for a long time, at the face that was weathered and careful, and she permitted herself to see this now genuinely decent in the specific unglamorous way that genuine decency works, not loudly, not romantically, but steadily, day after day, in small decisions made when no one was watching. He had not placed himself between her and the situation as a performance of protection. He had done it the way he checked the water barrel before coming inside, because that was what needed to be done, and that was who he was. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. He picked up his hat. I'm going to check the north fence before dark, he said. You should eat something. She almost laughed. You're worried about the fence. I'm worried about the fence and I'm worried about you, he said. The fence, at least I can do something about tonight. He went out. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about a man who was going to check his fence in the cold before dark because that was what needed to be done. And that was who he was, and she thought, I am in very serious trouble here and I would not trade it for anything. She wrote the message to Aldwell that night. Cisco had returned from his Santa Fe route 2 days earlier, and she found him before dawn the next morning and paid him a premium to ride again immediately. He looked at her face and at the sealed packet in her hand and didn't ask questions. There and back as fast as you can, she said. Yes, ma'am, he said. She watched him ride north in the cold pre-dawn and thought about the 2 days she had and what they needed to contain. She thought about the letter again in the gray pre-dawn quiet after Cisco left. She thought about what it meant that Preston had circled the name Dalton in his notes, that he had known his brother was alive, had known for 2 months before he died and had not told her. She understood the not telling in a way she hadn't understood it in April. In April, it had felt like one more withholding. Now, standing on this side of it, she thought it might have been something different. Not a withholding, but a protection. He had known she was in danger if she knew. He had been trying to keep her clear of it until he could find a way through, and the time had run out before he found the way. The protection had been its own kind of condescension. I will manage this without telling you. I will decide what you need to know, and she did not excuse it on those grounds. But she understood it better than she had. She understood that a man can love someone and manage them at the same time, and that both things can be true and that neither truth cancels the other. She thought, I am done being managed. I am managing this myself. This is what doing it myself looks like. She went back inside and started on the cross-reference document. Vera Marsh spent Friday writing at the boarding house table, organizing the combined evidence into a narrative document that could be published in the Albuquerque Courier the moment the federal case was opened. Clara had asked her to hold it until then. Vera had agreed with the professional composure of a journalist who understood that a story published too soon is a story that can be suppressed. Gideon went to see Dunbar on Friday afternoon. He came back an hour later and sat at the kitchen table. Dunbar will not cooperate with Harlan without seeing Harlan's federal warrant, he said. If Harlan can't produce one, and if Aldwell moves first, Dunbar will stand aside. That's something, Clara said. What did you tell him? That the Callaway easement was fraudulently filed and that there was a federal investigation already opened. I didn't give him names. He paused. He already knew. He didn't say so, but he knew. He's been waiting to see which way the wind goes. Clara looked at him. And now he knows the wind is going against Harlan, she said. I think so, Gideon said. I think he's been waiting for someone to tell him it's safe to know that. They sat in the kitchen, and outside the wind moved off the mesa cold and steady. Nora was in her room with her schoolwork. The iron box sat on the kitchen shelf open now, its contents organized and copied and partially en route to Santa Fe. Nora knew something was happening. She was 10 years old, and she had her father's particular gift for reading the temperature of a room, and she had spent 3 weeks watching Clara with serious, comprehensive attention. On Thursday evening, the night before Harlan was due to arrive, she came to the kitchen doorway in her nightgown with her arms crossed in the posture that meant she was preparing to ask a question she wasn't certain she had the right to ask. Is something bad coming? She said. Clara looked up from the papers. She thought about how to answer this. She had spent 3 years being managed by someone who answered every difficult question with something smooth and untrue. And she had learned from the inside out how much that costs, not just to the person being managed, but to the relationship, to the trust, to the sense that truth is something anyone is willing to say out loud. She was not going to do that to Nora. A difficult situation is coming, she said. Not dangerous, not in the way that means anyone's going to be hurt. But a man is coming to town who is going to try to take me away from here, and I'm going to make sure he can't. Nora stood in the doorway and absorbed this. Is he the one you ran from? She said. Clara met her eyes steadily. Yes. And you're not going to run again? No, Clara said. I'm done running. Nora thought about this with the serious, careful thinking face that looked so much like Gideon's. It sometimes caught Clara off guard, that particular quality of a person giving a question the full weight it deserved. What are we going to do? She said. Clara noted the we without remarking on it. Tomorrow morning before school, she said. I'm going to meet with the woman at the boarding house. She's a journalist. She writes for a newspaper in Albuquerque. She has information that, together with mine, is enough to stop the man who's coming. She paused. Your father is going to ride to see the sheriff, and a federal attorney in Santa Fe has been given everything he needs to open a formal case. What do I do? Nora asked. You go to school, Clara said. You have your arithmetic examination on Friday? Nora's expression shifted very slightly. That's not what I meant, she said. I know, Clara said. I'm telling you the most important thing you can do, which is to let the people who are handling this handle it. You being at school safe is what I need. Nora stood in the doorway for another moment. All right, she said. She started to turn away, then stopped. Clara, yes. He's not going to take you, she said. Not a question, a declaration. No, Clara said. He's not. Nora went to bed. Clara sat for a long time after looking at the papers and thinking about a 10-year-old girl who had lost her mother and kept her father's secrets and was prepared with remarkable composure to claim a woman she'd known for 3 weeks as someone worth fighting for. She had not expected to be claimed. She had not thought to want it. She understood now that she had been wrong about both. She thought about Nora's mother, a woman she knew almost nothing about except that she had left, and that her leaving it had shaped this household in ways that were still present in every careful avoidance, every managed silence, every moment. When Nora looked at her father with the specific alertness of a child monitoring something she had decided was her responsibility to watch, she did not hold the leaving against the woman. She had learned from her own experience that people leave situations that are wrong for them, and that the wrongness is not always visible to anyone standing outside it. But she understood the cost of the leaving in the way that only the person who remained could understand it, in the child who had organized herself around an absence, in the man who had built a lie to cover his own grief in the house that had contracted itself around what was left. She was not going to add to the show. She was going to be worth the arrival. Saturday came cold and cloudless, the kind of October day that feels like a held breath. Judge Harlan Beale arrived in Sweetwater Crossing in the early afternoon on a gray horse with 2 men flanking him. They were not investigators. They were the kind of men Harlan kept for situations that had moved past investigation, larger men, quieter men, whose purpose was less to ask questions than to discourage the asking of them. He came to the ranch. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the horses in the yard. She looked out the window and saw them. She looked at the iron box on the shelf now, containing only copies the originals were in Aldwell's hands, or very nearly. She had Vera's copies. She had everything she needed. She had prepared for this. She took a breath. She went out. The yard was ordinary in the way that yards are ordinary. The corral, the barn, the windmill, turning in the cold, the red earth going pale in the November light. She stood in the middle of it and watched Harlan ride through the gate and pull up his horse, and she felt the particular quality of this moment, the convergence of 6 months of preparation with the reality she had been preparing for, and she let herself feel it fully, and then she set it aside because there was no room right now for feeling. He looked older than she remembered. The months since Preston's funeral had not been gentle to him, but his composure was intact, the specific composure of a man who has calculated every angle in a room before he enters it and who has never yet entered a room he could not control. Clara, Harlan said when he saw her come through the door. He said her name with the particular warmth of a man who has decided warmth is the most effective opening position. There you are. You had us all worried. Harlan, she said. Gideon had come from the barn. He stood at the edge of the yard, equidistant between her and the riders, with his hat pushed back and his face showing nothing useful. His hands were at his sides, still, ready, not threatening, simply present with the specific quality of presence that is its own form of statement. I've come to bring you home, Harlan said. You've had a difficult time. Grief makes us do things we wouldn't ordinarily do. He looked briefly at Gideon with the specific dismissal of a man who considers obstacles rather than people. This arrangement, no one blames you. Preston's death was hard on everyone. Preston's death, she said, a brief flicker. He hadn't expected her to stop him there. Of course, you were in shock. You made a decision that I stand behind, she said. Something hardened in his face. The warmth became its own opposite, not quite cold, but the temperature of quiet authority, the voice of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. Clara, his voice changed. I have with me a document from the Missouri Circuit requiring you to appear to complete the administration of Preston's estate. There are records that need to be examined, documents that may be relevant to certain proceedings. There are, she agreed pleasantly. They're in Santa Fe. He went very still. They arrived yesterday morning, she said, along with a full account of the trust fund disbursements, the Callaway Land Syndicate payments, the altered survey filings, and a complete history of the territorial jurisdiction expansion you arranged 5 months ago. She watched his face carefully. Federal Attorney Aldwell has been in receipt of those materials since approximately yesterday noon. I expect he's had time to read them by now. Harlan stood very still on his gray horse. She watched him recalibrate. She had watched him do this before in courtrooms at dinner tables across open graves. He was a man who was never without a position to retreat to, and she watched him assess his positions now with the rapid practiced assessment of someone who has always had options and is discovering that the options are fewer than they should be. You're making a serious mistake, he said. I've thought about that carefully, she said. I don't believe I am. He looked at Gideon. His eyes made the calculation that a man like Harlan always makes the assessment of what can be used, what can be pressured, where the leverage is. He was looking for a way to make this situation cost someone something. That was how he operated. That was what she had been preparing for. Your water rights dispute, he said to Gideon. The Callaway easement is legally filed. Is fraudulently filed, Gideon said. His voice was completely even. As the territorial surveyor will confirm when he arrives next week. As the federal case against you will demonstrate in considerable detail. Harlan looked from one of them to the other, and Clara watched him make the calculation she had been waiting for him to make, the slow, cold recognition that the situation was not what he had prepared for. That he had ridden into this yard expecting a frightened woman with a box of papers she didn't know how to use, and found instead a woman who had spent 6 months learning exactly how to use them with a room full of witnesses and a federal attorney already reading. Sheriff Dunbar, he said, is aware of the federal investigation, Clara said. I believe he mentioned it to you this morning. He mentioned it to me this afternoon. A silence that had weight in it. Harlan Beale looked at her across the yard of the Holt Ranch in the cold November afternoon, with the red mesa behind her and the enormous patient sky overhead, and she looked back at him, and she did not look away, and she was not afraid. She thought about Preston pressing the box into her hands in April. She thought about the train platform in Dodge City. She thought about the first evening in this kitchen, sitting across from a man she didn't know, with an iron box in her lap and a story she couldn't tell yet. She thought about 3 weeks of learning what she had been wrong about and what she had been right about and what was still possible. She thought, I am standing in my yard. This is my yard. He has no authority here. She thought about Dalton Beecham surviving Kennesaw Mountain on stubbornness alone, gathering for years in a territory where he officially did not exist, trusting that what he built would be used. She thought it was used. It is being used right now. She thought he was right to trust. This isn't finished, Harlan said. No, she said. It isn't, but it's begun, and you're not going to stop it from here. He held her gaze for a long moment, then he turned his horse. She watched him ride out of the yard with his 2 men behind him, and she stood in the cold afternoon and breathed, and Gideon came to stand beside her and did not touch her and did not say anything and was simply there, which was, she thought, exactly what she needed. He'll go back and regroup, she said. Probably, Gideon said. Al said. He'll try to complicate the federal case. He has connections. Probably, Gideon said again. This is not over. No, he said, but today it's over. She looked at the gate where Harlan's horse had been. Today it's over, she said. Nora appeared in the doorway of the house, her serious face tracking them with a careful assessment she turned on everything important. Is he gone? She said. For now, Gideon said. Nora looked from her father to Clara and back. Good, she said, and went back inside. Clara stood in the yard and looked at the mesa going dark against the sky. And she thought about the iron box on the kitchen shelf and Vera Marsh writing at the boarding house table, and Cisco somewhere on the road to Santa Fe, and the letter Preston had written her that she had read once and folded carefully and would need to read again many times before she understood all of what it meant. She thought about hope and whether what she was feeling now was the same hope she had felt 3 weeks ago or something larger. She thought it might be something larger. The weeks after Harlan Beale's departure from the ranch yard had the particular quality of an aftermath, not peace exactly, but the absence of immediate danger, which is its own form of rest. The air in the house was different. She noticed it in Nora first, a loosening around the shoulders, a return of the humming. She did her schoolwork at the kitchen table instead of retreating to her room, and the humming was always something incomplete, always something invented on the spot, and Gideon would hear it from across the house and turn his head toward the sound the way a man turns toward a fire, unconsciously, because it was warm and the alternative was dark. Clara permitted herself no similar loosening. She knew better. Harlan was not a man who rode away from a fight. He was a man who reorganized after a setback, and reorganizing was where he did some of his best work. She had watched him do it from inside the family through 3 years of Abilene dinner parties, where she had sat at the far end of the table and listened to men she was not supposed to be listening to. She had watched him sustain a gracious surface over a current of calculation, and she had watched the people around him fail to see the current because the surface was so good. She was not going to fail to see it. She checked the accounts. She reviewed the copies she had kept of everything sent to Aldwell. She wrote a careful letter to Birch and Topeka, her father's old colleague, the one person in Kansas she trusted entirely, confirming that the chain of custody on the original documents was intact and asking him to hold everything until further word. She was building the structure the way she built everything from the outside edges inward, making sure the perimeter was solid before she touched the interior. 4 days after Harlan left, Aldwell wrote from Santa Fe. The federal case was open, the materials had been received and reviewed, and were, Aldwell wrote, among the most complete and carefully organized evidentiary packages he had encountered in 20 years of federal practice. He complimented her work with the dry precision of a man who gives compliments rarely and means them when he does. He also wrote, Beale has retained counsel in Washington. This will take time and he will contest every step. Do not relax your vigilance. She read it twice, folded it, and filed it in her traveling bag under things she knew. She told Gideon that evening at the kitchen table. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without preparing his response while she was still talking, his hands flat on the wood surface and his attention fully present. When she finished, he said, How long? Months, she said. Maybe longer. He'll find procedural ways to slow it. He always has. But it's open. It's open, she said. It's in federal hands, and it's open, and Harlan can't close it from here. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, all right. She had learned by now what that meant. It was not resignation. It was not defeat. It was the particular response of a man who has spent 11 years absorbing bad news about the water rights, who had learned to take the shape of a thing in and then set it in the proper place, and then get up the next morning and do what the morning required. He had the specific endurance of someone who has been practicing endurance for a long time without anyone having called it that. She found it privately one of the most useful qualities she had ever encountered in a person. Harlan's territorial jurisdiction over New Mexico was suspended pending review. The word came through Turner Dunbar. Now she reminded herself this territory's sheriff had a different name than the one she kept defaulting to the following Monday morning when he rode out to the ranch with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man delivering news he finds genuinely satisfying. The Callaway Land Syndicate's January enforcement claim went into immediate limbo. The territorial surveyor was due the following Tuesday. Gideon said nothing when she told him, but she watched something happen in the set of his shoulders, a fraction of a degree of relief so carefully contained She would have missed it if she hadn't been paying close attention to the exact architecture of how he carried difficulty. She had been paying very close attention. The surveyor arrived on a gray Tuesday morning with two assistants and a set of instruments in cases that looked like they cost more than the Holt Ranch's annual feed bill. His name was Godwin. He was a thin, precise man who said almost nothing, looked at everything, and spent 2 full days walking the north boundary with his notebooks and his measuring chains before he said anything definitive. On the second afternoon, he came to the kitchen with mud on his boots and accepted coffee without removing his coat and told them in the flat, declarative manner of a man whose professional value lies in stating exactly what is, and nothing more, that the easement filing contained altered survey markers, that the dates on 3 separate Callaway filings did not match the territorial register from those years, and that his preliminary findings supported the original 1871 Holt grant without qualification. He left before dark. Gideon stood in the kitchen doorway after the sound of hoofbeats faded and looked at the north ridge line, visible through the window over the sink, catching the last flat November light. He did not say anything for almost a full minute. Clara stood beside him and said nothing either. She had learned the grammar of his silences, which were the silences of a man working something through, and which were the silences that had come to their natural completion and only needed to be witnessed. This was the second kind. 9 years, he said finally, quietly. Yes, she said, 9 years farming around something that was never real. She looked at the ridge. It was real enough to cost you 9 years, she said. The harm was real. It always is when someone lies on a filing. The land doesn't know it was a lie. The grass didn't grow any better because the document was fraudulent. He turned and looked at her. That's a careful way to say something angry, he said. She met his eyes. I am angry on your behalf. I'm trying to manage the expression of it. Something shifted in his face, the almost smile she was learning, to recognize the one that never quite reached his mouth, but was entirely visible in his eyes if you knew where to look. You don't have to manage it, he said. Force of habit, she said. I managed most things for 3 years. I'm working on unlearning it. He looked at her for a moment. You can be angry here, he said. That's permitted. She held his gaze. She thought about what it meant, that sentence, the plain and enormous kindness of it. She had lived for 3 years in a house where certain emotions were not permitted, where her anger was a problem to be solved, her precision was an oddity to be smiled at. Her intelligence was something to be displayed on appropriate occasions and put away on all others. She had learned to manage herself with such thoroughness that she sometimes could not find the unmanaged thing underneath. He was offering her permission to find it. I know, she said. Thank you. He nodded once and turned back to the window in the ridge, and they stood together in the kitchen in the fading afternoon and were quietly and specifically angry on each other's behalf, which is one of the more useful things two people can do together. Dora Kinsley came to the ranch on a Thursday in early December. She came without her apron. Just herself, a woman in a good traveling coat with her hair up and her hands free, not carrying anything for the household. She sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Clara poured her and said what she had come to say with the directness of a woman who has thought carefully about what she owes a situation and has decided to pay it. I'm going to Colorado, she said. My sister married a man in Denver. She's been asking me to come for 2 years, and I've been finding reasons to stay, and I think it's time to stop finding reasons. Clara looked at her. When are you leaving? She said. Saturday week. Dora held her coffee cup in both hands. I wanted to tell you directly, not through Waylon, through Gideon. She corrected herself without fuss, without making anything of it, the way a person adjusts to a new fact. I think that's the right way. I think so too, Clara said. Dora was quiet for a moment. I want to say something, she said, and I want you to know I'm saying it because it's true, not because I think it's what you want to hear, or because I need something from you. She looked at her hands. Adeline and I were close, closer than most people here knew. When she left, when she went to Tucson with the man she'd met, I told myself I stayed for Lily, for Gideon, that it was about the child needing a consistent presence, and it was. But it was also about me not knowing how to leave the last place I'd been close to Adeline. She looked up. I think I was holding on to something that wasn't mine to hold. I think I knew it before you arrived. I just needed the arrival to make it clear. Clara looked at her. What will you do in Denver? She said. My brother-in-law runs a printing shop. He's been trying to hire someone with organizational skill for a year. And there's a woman there, a friend from before I came to Sweetwater Crossing, who I've been writing to since her husband died. She paused. More than writing. Clara understood the careful nature of this confidence and received it accordingly. Good, she said simply. Dora almost smiled. It was the smile of a woman who has said a difficult thing and found it accepted without drama. Be good to them, Dora said. Both of them. I intend to, Clara said. They shook hands. It was the handshake of two women who had been in complicated proximity and had come through it without serious damage, which was more than either of them had been certain of in October. Clara stood at the window and watched Dora walk back toward town, and she thought about the pressed curtains and the dried flowers in the jar and the good coffee, all of it, the careful claiming of a space by a woman who had needed the claiming, even as she'd known on some level that the thing she was claiming could not hold. She hoped Denver was kind to her. She thought it probably would be. Dora Kinsley was a woman who made things work, and women who make things work tend to find places where their work is wanted. Nora cried a little when she heard. Not much. She was not built for prolonged crying. She had her father's specific compression about emotion, the habit of taking the shape of a hard thing in and then getting very still around it. But a little in her room that evening, with the door not quite closed, which was as much as Nora would admit to needing. Clara gave her 20 minutes. Then she knocked, waited for the muffled acknowledgement, and went in. She did not sit on the bed. She had learned by now that sitting on someone's bed when they have been crying is an assumption about intimacy that has to be earned before it can be offered. She sat on the floor instead, back against the wall below eye level, and waited. Nora was on the bed with her arms crossed and her jaw set and her eyes recently red, but managing the evidence of it with the stubborn efficiency of a child who considers crying a private thing that has been inadvertently made public and is now dealing with the consequences. She was good to you, Clara said. Yes, Nora said. You're allowed to be sad she's going. I know that, Nora said with a fraction of irritation that was actually more reassuring than distress. You can be biased and still understand why it's the right thing. Nora looked at her, assessing. Do you understand why it's the right thing, she said. Clara considered whether to answer simply or honestly. She chose honestly because Nora had always responded better to honest. I think Dora came here because of your mother, she said carefully. Not to replace her, she wasn't trying to do that. But she loved your mother, and when your mother left, this house was where she felt closest to her. So she stayed. And she was good here. She was genuinely good to you and to your father. But I don't think this was ever quite the life she was building toward. I think she knew that for a while before she was ready to leave. Nora was quiet for a moment. Did Mama know she loved her, she said. This was a more complicated question than it appeared, and Clara understood that from the way Nora asked it carefully with the specific care of a child who has been carrying a thought for a long time and is now choosing to say it out loud. I think so, Clara said. I think people who love each other that way usually know. Do you think Mama loved her back? I think your mother was a person who needed a different life, Clara said. Not a worse person than the one she left behind, just someone who needed different things. Whether she loved Dora, I don't know your mother well enough to answer that honestly. Nora looked at the ceiling. Papa says she wasn't cruel, she said. He says she was just wrong-fitted, like a saddle that's good leather but cut for the wrong horse. That's a fair way to say it, Clara said. He made it up, Nora said. I could tell. He was trying to give me something to hold on to. Clara looked at her. That's what people do, she said, when they love someone and don't have the exact right words. They give you something approximate and hope it's close enough to be useful. Nora was quiet for a long time. You were right, she said finally. About what? About Dora. She should go to Denver. She uncrossed her arms. I'm still sad. You're allowed to be both. I know, Nora said. I just wanted you to know I understand. Clara looked at this child with her rock collection and her serious face and her 10 years of carefully born understanding and felt the particular kind of love that comes from watching someone be precisely who they are, not who they have been told to be, not who grief made them, but the person underneath all of that intact and specific and worth knowing. I know you do, Clara said. That's one of the things about you. Nora looked at her. Something moved in her face, the small adjustment of a child receiving something she has been wanting without having known how to ask for it. She didn't say anything, but she didn't ask Clara to leave. They sat together for another half hour, Nora on the bed above Clara on the floor below, talking about small things and then nothing at all. And outside, the December cold pressed at the windows, and the desert was dark and patient, and the lamp burned low on Nora's shelf between her rock collection and the small carved horse Gideon had made her the year her mother left. December settled over the Cimarron Ridge with a cold that was clean and dry, not the damp, gray cold of Kansas, but something crystalline, the kind that made the air taste like iron, and the stars at night seem impossibly close. She had been at the ranch 2 months. She had stopped counting the days sometime around mid-November, which she recognized as a kind of milestone, the moment when you stop measuring a place by when you arrived and start measuring it by what comes next. The evenings had found their rhythm, Nora in her room with her schoolwork, the house contracting to its nighttime configuration, Gideon at the far end of the table with the accounts or the journal he no longer closed when she came near, and Clara across from him with her own papers, and between them, the lamp and the particular silence that had become, without either of them arranging for it, the texture of evenings in this house. They talked more now, not the careful, calibrated conversations of people who are still assessing each other, but the looser talk of people who have already assessed and found the assessment settled. He told her things about the land, the water table under the north pasture, the specific behavior of the Cimarron runoff in February, the 3 sections of fence that needed replacing every 2 years because of something in the soil. She told him things about the federal case, what Aldwell's letters implied about the timeline, how a Washington attorney's involvement would likely slow the process, what she expected from the next 6 months. They talked about things that had nothing to do with the immediate situation, the specific smell of the sage after rain, the way the Kansas prairie had felt like the whole world until you stood under a New Mexico sky. The book he was reading, a surveyor's memoir from the 1840s that he had found in a box of Adeline's things and had never opened until last spring when the water case had made everything about survey documents feel personal. One evening in the second week of December, he pushed back from the table and said without preamble, "I want to tell you something about Grace." She set down her pen. She had heard the name once before, a neighbor's reference, quickly moved past. She had not asked. "Adeline," she said. "Is that what she went by?" "Grace was her name," he said. "Adeline Grace. She preferred Grace." He looked at his coffee. "I didn't tell Nora that. I told Nora her mother was called Adeline, which was the name on the church register. I told her that because Grace it felt too much like she'd taken something with her when she left. So I gave Nora the formal name and kept the other one." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm telling you now because I think I'm done keeping it." She looked at him. "What was she like?" she said. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Quick on," he said. "Very quick. She would have a thought and speak it before she'd finish thinking it, and sometimes the thought was brilliant and sometimes it was half-built, but you never had to wait to know what she was thinking." He looked at his hands. "I loved that about her at first. It was everything I wasn't. I was slow and deliberate, and she was like weather, like something that happened fast and real and didn't apologize for it." He paused. "The ranch was wrong for her from the beginning. I knew it. I think I believed she would adapt the way people adapt to things they've chosen. But choosing and adapting are different, and I didn't understand that then." "When did you understand it?" Clara asked. "The second winter," he said. "She told me she felt like she was disappearing. She told me the silence was, she called it, a physical weight, that she couldn't breathe in a place where the same 20 square miles were all that existed." He looked at the table. "I didn't know how to give her more than what I had. The land was what I had. The work was what I had. I kept making things, the third outbuilding, the new roof on the barn, because making things was how I showed that I cared about the life we were building, and I didn't understand until too late that she didn't need another outbuilding. She needed a city. She needed voices and movement and the particular friction of many people occupying the same space." He paused. "I couldn't give her that, so she went and found it." "And Nora," Clara said. "Nora was 3, he said. Grace offered to take her. I said no." He looked up. "She didn't fight it. I think she knew at 3 Nora needed the land more than the city. Nora, as she has always been, more mine than Grace's, in the way that children sometimes land more thoroughly in one parent than the other." He looked at the table. "I said she died because I was ashamed. Not of her, of myself, of having failed at something so completely that the honest answer was worse than the lie I told. He exhaled slowly. I've been carrying that a long time. Clara looked at him. When are you going to tell Nora? She said. I was thinking that he said that I might tell her this week. She held his gaze. I think she already knows more than you think she does. I think so too, he said. She's been managing me about it for 2 years. I just didn't know that was what she was doing until you said it. She looked at the lamp. What you just told me, she said. About Grace, about the second winter, about the outbuilding, instead of the city, that was an honest account of what happened, without making it anyone's fault and without making yourself the hero of a story where you were actually just a person who made a mistake and then another mistake trying to cover it. She paused. If you tell Nora that not the performed version, the actual version, the way you just told me, she'll understand. She understands most things. He looked at her. You make it sound simple, he said. It isn't simple, she said. But the difficult part isn't the telling. The difficult part is getting yourself ready to tell it. And I think you're already ready. He was quiet for a long time. I wasn't sure, he said finally. When you said you wanted to stay, I wasn't sure if you meant it in the practical sense or in the other sense. She looked at him carefully. In the other sense, she said. Something shifted in his expression. He looked at the table and then at her, and then at the table again, and she watched him do the things she had observed him do 100 times, the careful approach to the true statement, by way of the approximate one, trusting her to be paying attention. You're the first person in a long time, he said, who I wanted to tell things to. Not because I needed to or because it was practical, because telling you made the things feel different, more settled. He stopped. I don't have a better word for it. Settled is a fine word, she said. He looked at her. I'm not going to be easy to be with, he said. I know that. I'm slow and I manage myself too much, and I'm not quick with words or gestures. I know you're not quick, she said. I've been watching you manage yourself since October. It's one of the things about you. Is that a problem? She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a man who had reorganized his coffee shelf without ceremony, who had checked his fence in the cold because that was what needed doing, who had told her she was allowed to be angry and had meant it in both directions. She thought about what Quick had looked like from the inside, Preston's quick intelligence, Preston's quick responses. The quick, tidy management of everything she said or did that had turned her into an accessory instead of a person. No, she said. Slow is exactly right. Slow, I know how to trust. He held her gaze. Something passed between them that was not quite anything yet, but was very clearly the beginning of something. Not dramatic, not declared, simply the acknowledgement by two careful people who had been moving in a direction and had now confirmed that they were moving in the same one. All right, he said. All right, she said. They went back to their papers, and outside the December wind moved off the mesa, and the windmill turned in the dark, and the stars were brilliant and close and entirely indifferent, and inside the kitchen was warm, and the lamp was steady, and that was enough. Gideon talked to Nora on a Friday evening after supper, after the kitchen was cleared, and Nora had settled at the table with her schoolwork, and then been gently redirected by her father to her room, which she understood was a signal that something was about to be said. Clara was in her own room with the door not quite closed, reading the water rights documentation for the 4th time, with the specific attention of a woman who believes that reading something 4 times is never a waste. She could hear the rhythm of the conversation, not the words, but the particular quality of it. Gideon's voice low and careful. Nora's responses less frequent than usual, which meant she was listening more than talking, which meant she was taking something in. It went on for 20 minutes. Then Nora's door closed, and Gideon's footsteps crossed the hall, and the kitchen produced the sounds of a man who needs to do something with his hands after something difficult. The coffee pot moved, the stove lid opened and shut. Clara gave him 10 minutes. Then she went to the kitchen. He was at the table with his coffee, looking at the window that faced north toward the ridge. He had the particular stillness of a man who has put down a weight and is now uncertain of his own balance, which she recognized from the inside. She had been carrying things for so long that setting them down was its own kind of difficulty. How did she take it, she said. He looked up. She said she already knew, he said. Most of it. Yes, she said. She said she'd known since she was 8. He turned the cup in his hands. She said she didn't tell me because she was worried about how I'd take it. She was protecting you, Clara said. I know. He set the cup down. 9 years old, and she's been managing my feelings about her own mother. She learned what the household required, Clara said carefully. Children learn that. She learned you needed to be protected from certain things, and she did what the household required. That's not a failure of hers. It's not a success of mine, he said. No, she said, but it's also not the fixed fact you're treating it as. It happened. You know it happened. Nora knows you know. That changes what comes next. She sat down across from him. What did she say when you told her the whole thing? He was quiet for a moment. She asked why I told people her mother died. He looked at the table. I told her the truth, that I was ashamed, that I had failed at something, and the honest answer was worse than the lie, and I chose the lie because I didn't know any better. What did she say? He looked up at her. She said, it's all right, Papa. I know you did the best you knew. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, the wind moved off the ridge. That's more forgiveness than you gave yourself, Clara said. More than I deserve, Papa. Children are generous beyond what their parents deserve, she said. It's one of the more remarkable things about them. She paused. Did she ask about Grace, about who she was? She asked what her mother was like, he said. I told her what I told you, the quick thinking and the weather quality of her. He looked at his hands. Nora said she sounds like she would have been interesting to know when she was older. She said it the way she says things, like she's reporting a meteorological fact. Clara felt the familiar tightening in her chest that she had come to recognize as the specific response to Nora being exactly herself at an unexpected moment. She said something else, Gideon said. She asked if you were going to stay. Clara was quiet. What did you tell her? She said. He looked up at her. I told her I hoped so, he said. I told her I was working on it. She looked at him, at the lamp between them, at the ordinary kitchen of a house that was becoming, against all practical planning, something she wanted rather than merely needed. That's a reasonable answer, she said. Is it enough? He said. She met his eyes. For now, she said, ask me again in spring. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she was learning to read, the one that contained things he hadn't found words for yet, but was no longer trying to hide from her. All right, he said, spring. Survey the Cat arrived on a Thursday 6 days before Christmas. He appeared at the barn door in the evening when Gideon was doing the last feeding a half-grown orange cat with the proprietary composure of an animal that has assessed the available options and found one satisfactory. Gideon brought him to the house, which Clara suspected had required less persuasion than he let on. The cat jumped immediately to the kitchen windowsill and arranged himself there with the settled certainty of a creature who has made a permanent decision about where he belongs. Nora claimed not to know where he had come from. Clara looked at Nora's carefully neutral expression and concluded privately that the cat had been obtained through some arrangement with a classmate whose barn cat had recently produced a litter. She also concluded that a 10-year-old who had spent 2 years quietly managing the emotional weather of a grieving household was probably entitled to acquire a cat through whatever practical means she found available. She said nothing about the cat's origins. Gideon, who had arrived at the same conclusion by the faster route of having known Nora for 10 years, also said nothing. Nora named him Survey, she said, after the territorial surveyor, because he had a very precise way of looking at things. Clara laughed at that quickly from somewhere genuine, and Nora looked pleased, and Gideon looked at both of them with the expression she was learning to recognize as his version of happiness, quiet and contained and entirely real, not theatrical, not performed for anyone, just present the way warmth is present in a room with a good fire. Survey, for his part, confirmed his name's aptness by surveying the entire house within the first 3 hours, designating the kitchen windowsill as his primary territory and the iron box on the shelf as his secondary territory, which he claimed by climbing into it and going to sleep with the completeness of an animal that had made its decision and considered the matter closed. On a Saturday afternoon in late December, 3 days before the new year, Clara went to the barn to check on Mesa, who had been slightly off his feet in the cold, and found Gideon there already. He was standing with his hand on the gray's neck and talking to him in a low voice, not particularly about anything, the comfortable, half-verbal talk of a man who has spent 20 years in close company with horses and has long since stopped needing the conversation to be dignified. When he heard her come in, he did not turn around immediately. He finished what he was saying to the horse. He's all right, he said then. Just the cold. I thought so, she said. He goes quieter when the temperature drops. He always has, Gideon said. 11 years and he still acts surprised when December gets cold. She came to stand beside him at Mesa's stall. The barn was warm with hay and animal heat, and outside the December cold made the interior warmth particular and good, and they stood together for a moment in the specific, comfortable quiet that had become the ground note of their time together. He turned and looked at her. She had learned to read his face, the gradations of it that had been invisible in October, and were now as readable to her as weather signs. She knew the expression of calculation. She knew the expression of attention. She knew the expression of the approach to something difficult, the particular compression around his eyes that meant he was assembling something, testing the words before he used them. This was different from all of those. Marin, he said. He used her first name only when something was real. Clara. The correction was immediate low. Habit, he said. I've been called worse things, she said. He almost smiled. Then he looked at her with the full direct attention of a man who has decided to stop being approximate. I want to say something, he said, and I'm going to say it imperfectly because I'm not. He stopped. I'll say it anyway. All right, she said. When I placed that advertisement, he said, I knew what I needed. A woman who could manage the household and read contracts and be steady with Nora and be honest about what she could and couldn't do. I knew what I needed and I wrote it down plainly, and I didn't expect anything beyond that. He looked at Mesa. And then you got off the train. She was quiet. You were steady, he said. You were everything I said I needed and more of it than I expected. You could read the documents and you sat with Nora on the floor when she was sad, and you were not afraid of any of the things I was afraid of, the isolation, the difficulty, the hard days. You called them workable. He looked at her. But that's not what I'm trying to say. Then say what you're trying to say, she said. He reached out and put his hand against her face, one calloused palm against her cheek, with the careful deliberateness of a man who is holding something he is uncertain he has the right to hold, who knows the difference between claiming and being given. She put her hand over his. I see you, he said. Not what you can do, not what you manage. You, what it costs you and what you choose anyway, and what you keep choosing. I see all of it. He held her gaze. I have not had anyone to tell things to in a very long time. And I have told you more in 2 months than I've told anyone in 9 years. And the telling it was not because you required it. It was because I wanted to. Because telling you made the things feel different afterward. More settled, like they were in the right place at last. She felt the particular tightening in her throat that she had learned over the past months was the response to being seen clearly by someone who was not trying to own what they saw. Gideon, she said. I care about you, he said. Not practically, not because you're what the ranch needs, though you are. Because you walked across that yard in October with a locked box and a story you weren't ready to tell, and you looked at everything here, including me, with those steady gray eyes, and you did not look away. He paused. I would like it very much if you stayed. She looked at him, at the weathered, careful face of a man who had rebuilt something from nothing twice over and who was, she thought, entirely worth knowing. You're comparing me to your land again, she said. I know, he said. I keep doing that. You keep doing that, she said, because it's the most honest language you have. And I find it considerably more useful than most of the other things people have said to me. She stepped toward him. He was still holding her face, and she put both hands against his chest, and she looked at him, the specific, unglamorous, genuinely decent man who had moved his coffee jar without ceremony and checked his fence in the cold and told her she was allowed to be angry and had meant every word of all of it, and she said, Gideon Holt, you are the most workable man I have ever met, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. He looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed real and from somewhere deep, and she laughed with him. And in the warm barn with the gray horse watching them, with the patient indifference of a creature who considers human behavior generally inexplicable, but occasionally entertaining, they stood together and laughed, and it was right. It was exactly right. He kissed her once very carefully, the way he did most things deliberately, without ceremony, meaning every part of it. She held on. He held on. Outside, the year was nearly over. The stars were beginning to appear in the early December dark, enormous and indifferent and brilliant, wheeling in their ancient patience over the red mesa and the ranch buildings and the windmill turning slow in the cold. And inside the barn, a man and a woman stood together in the warmth and held on, and it was a beginning. That evening, Nora came to the barn to say supper was ready and found them. She looked at her father's hand on Clara's arm. She looked at her father's face open and unguarded, and showing for once and without management exactly what was in it. She looked at Clara. Finally, she said, and went back to the house. Clara looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Clara. And for the second time that evening in the warm barn with the old horse watching them, with patient equine wisdom, they laughed the shared, genuine, helpless laughter of two people who have just received the most accurate possible verdict on their situation from a 10-year-old girl with a gift for precise assessment. January arrived with snow, not the deep blanketing snow she had grown up with in Topeka, the kind that settled over the plains like a judgment and stayed for months. This was something different. An inch, perhaps two, sifted down overnight onto the red earth, crystalline and precise, and the whole landscape turned alien and beautiful in the early morning light, red showing through white in patches like embers banked low, like something very old, sleeping under something new. She stood at the east window of her room in the early quiet and watched it, and she thought, I have a window I think of as mine. I have a landscape I think of as mine. Both of these things happen without my quite noticing, and they are true regardless. She had been allowing herself to use the word home for 3 weeks now. It fit. The article appeared in the Albuquerque Courier on the 14th of January. Vera Marsh had written it with the controlled precision of a journalist who understands that the most dangerous stories must be constructed most carefully, every fact sourced, every claim attributable, every figure documented so thoroughly that the only honest response to it is silence or surrender. The headline read, Federal investigation opens into Missouri Circuit Judge, land fraud and corruption alleged in 3 territories. It was the kind of headline that traveled. By the time Gideon rode into Sweetwater Crossing for supplies 3 days after the paper arrived, the whole town already knew. The men at the feed store had discussed it at length. Dunbar at the sheriff's office had looked at Gideon over the counter with an expression that was very close to relief, the expression of a man who has been waiting to know which way a thing will fall and has finally been told. Dunbar said the territorial governor's office contacted him about the Callaway easement. Gideon told her that evening, setting his hat on the peg by the door and coming to the kitchen table where she was working. The company's legal team withdrew its January enforcement claim. Yesterday? Clara set down her pen. They withdrew, she said, yesterday morning. She looked at the kitchen shelf where the iron box sat empty, now its contents in Santa Fe in federal custody, properly archived and cataloged. The box itself was simply a box again. A small iron container that a man had pressed into his wife's hands on an April afternoon in Abilene, telling her there wasn't much time. She had kept it safe. The North Water is yours, she said. He looked at her across the table, and his expression did what she had learned it sometimes did. It became something she did not have a clean word for, something that included all the long difficulty of the previous 9 years in the fact of her sitting across from him in the lamplight and the distance between those two things. The North Water is ours, he said. She looked at him for a moment. She allowed herself to feel the full weight of what that small word contained. Yes, she said, ours. The letter from Harlan's legal counsel arrived in the second week of February. It was 3 pages written on expensive stationery in the careful language of men who are paid to sound reasonable while being entirely otherwise. It proposed that in exchange for Clara withdrawing her cooperation with the federal investigation, the estate of Preston Beecham would be settled in full, with a generous sum released to her directly and all outstanding claims dismissed. It also suggested in the elegant oblique language that such letters favor that continued cooperation with the federal process would be costly in ways both financial and reputational. She read it twice. She sat at the kitchen table for a moment, with her hands flat on the wood surface, and thought about Harlan Beale in his courtroom, the black robe, the composed authority, the precise patience of a man who had never once been told no by anyone he considered worth listening to. Then she picked up her pen and wrote her response. 1 page, 4 sentences. She showed it to Gideon before she sealed it. He read it. He set it down. Short, he said. I said what needed saying, she said. He looked at her with the expression that was not quite pride and not quite tenderness, but contained both and other things besides. Yes, he said, you always do. She sent the letter through the county post the next morning. She did not hear from Harlan's counsel again. The formal water rights ruling came on a Thursday in late February. 12 pages of precise legal language delivered by the Territorial Surveyor's Office with the dry efficiency of a document that has been anticipated for a long time. It resolved without ambiguity or qualification that the Callaway Land Syndicate's easement filing had been executed with fraudulently altered documentation, that the survey markers had been duplicated and incorrectly registered, and that the North Spring water rights belonged to the Holt property under the original 1871 territorial grant without interruption or qualification. The conclusion was final. It was not subject to appeal within the territorial system. And it had come, the ruling made clear, not because anyone had been generous, but because the evidence was overwhelming and the conclusion was the only honest one the surveyor could reach. Gideon read it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning while Nora was at school and the coffee was still hot, and Survey was doing his morning arrangement of himself on the windowsill. He read it all the way through once. Then he set it on the table and then looked at it for a long moment. 9 years, he said. She did not say anything. She let him have the silence. 9 years of farming around it, he said, my mom, keeping the south pasture light because I wasn't certain what rights held up north. Not putting water line to the east meadow because the whole thing felt like it could be pulled out from under me at any moment. He looked at the ruling. The north meadow. I've never used it the way it should be used. The grass up there, there's good grass along the spring. I've always known it, and I've always stayed off it. What would you do with it? She asked. He looked up at her. In spring, he said, I'd like to ride up and look at it. What it could be. He paused. I'd like you to come. She understood that he was not entirely talking about the meadow. Yes, she said, I would like that very much. He held her gaze for a moment, steady, warm, unguarded in the way he was becoming more comfortable being in her presence, and then he looked back down at the ruling, and she watched him quietly without announcement, place his weight on the new reality, and find it solid. 9 years, he said again, not with bitterness, with the particular exhale of a man who has been braced for a long time and is finally carefully allowing himself to let his shoulders down. Vera Marsh's second article appeared in the Courier in the last week of February. It was more detailed than the first and considerably more devastating because the first article had told the public what had happened and the second article showed them exactly how. The financial records were reproduced in summary. The names of 3 territorial judges who had been appointed through Harlan's influence were documented alongside their subsequent rulings, which showed a pattern so consistent it could not be explained as coincidence and could not be dismissed as interpretation. The Callaway Land Syndicate's payment history was laid out in clean columns that any reader with basic arithmetic could follow. It was the kind of journalism that cannot be suppressed after the fact. Once it is in print, it is in the archive. Once it is in the archive, it is permanent. Clara read it at the kitchen table and thought about Dalton Beecham, a man she had never met who had survived Kennesaw Mountain on stubbornness alone and come west, and spent 3 years gathering from the outside what Preston gathered from the inside, and who had died of cholera in Albuquerque with his case still open. She thought he can read this wherever the dead go. He can see that it was finished. She hoped that was a comfort. She thought it probably was. It was on a Wednesday evening in late February that Nora announced her intentions. She came home from school and set her bag on the chair by the door and her lunch pail on the table with the efficiency of a child who has been thinking about something all day and has organized it into a form suitable for presentation. Mrs. Greer says women can't be lawyers, she said, sitting down across from Clara. Clara looked up from the survey document she was annotating. She thought about how to answer this. She had spent 3 years being managed by someone who answered difficult questions with something smooth and untrue, and she had learned from the inside out how much that costs. Mrs. Greer is technically correct that women are currently not admitted to most bar associations in the United States, she said. She is incorrect that this will always be true. Nora sat down across from her. How do you know it won't always be true? Because the argument for excluding women from law is not a good argument, Clara said. It is a practical arrangement that benefits the people who currently hold the positions. Practical arrangements that benefit the people who hold positions tend to change when those people change, or when the cost of maintaining the arrangement becomes higher than the benefit. Nora's expression shifted, the slow, careful shift of a very intelligent child processing something genuinely new. Is that what happened with the water rights? She said. The Callaway people thought the arrangement benefited them, so they kept it. Clara looked at her. Yes, she said. That is exactly what happened. And it stopped working for them when the cost got too high. When the evidence made maintaining the arrangement more expensive than abandoning it, Clara said. Yes, that is precisely what happened. Nora turned this over. So the way to change things, she said slowly, is to make the cost of not changing higher than the cost of changing. Often, Clara said, or to find the people who have the authority to change it and give them a reason to use it. She paused. Both at once is best. Nora nodded slowly with the deliberate expression of someone filing important information in a place where it will be easy to find. I'm going to be a lawyer, she said. Clara looked at her steadily. You're 10 years old, she said. I know, Nora said. I have time to prepare. She picked up her school bag and went to her room to do her arithmetic without another word on the subject, in the manner of a person who has stated a conclusion and considers the discussion complete. Clara sat at the kitchen table and looked at the doorway through which Nora had disappeared, and she felt something move through her chest that she recognized now, without needing to examine it. It was simply love, uncomplicated and specific, the kind that comes from watching someone be exactly who they are. When Gideon came in from the barn an hour later and found her still at the table with a small expression he had learned to recognize, she told him what Nora had said. He stood in the doorway and listened. She's going to be something, he said. Yes, Clara said. She is. He came and sat at the table and picked up his coffee, and they both looked at the doorway to the back of the house where Nora's lamp was still on, and neither of them said anything more, because sometimes what you feel is too exact for words, and you do better to simply sit with it. The formal federal charges against Judge Harlan Beale were filed on a Tuesday in the first week of April. 18 counts across 3 territories: fraud, bribery, theft from a public trust, conspiracy to falsify official court documents, and the manipulation of territorial judicial appointments for personal financial benefit. His Washington attorney issued a statement calling the charges politically motivated and promising a vigorous defense. The statement appeared in several newspapers. It did not appear in the Albuquerque Courier because Vera Marsh had already run her 3rd article that same afternoon, the one with the financial records reproduced in their entirety, the one that named every payment and every ruling and every date. And by the time the Washington attorney's statement arrived, the Courier's readers had already read something considerably more informative. Dunbar came to the ranch the next morning. She heard the horses in the yard and came out to find him standing at the gate with his hat in his hands. He looked like someone carrying something he was glad to set down. Ma'am, he said, I wanted to tell you personally, the charges are filed. The county's position on the Callaway water rights is formally resolved. Any future dispute goes through the territorial court. He paused. Not the circuit. Thank you, Sheriff, she said. He turned his hat twice in his hands. I should tell you, I knew the Callaway situation wasn't right. I knew it for 2 years. I didn't know how far it went, but I knew the easement documentation had problems. He met her eyes. I should have moved sooner, I know that. She looked at him for a moment. You moved when you could, she said. That's what matters now. He nodded. He put his hat back on. You've done something considerable here, he said. I want you to know I understand that. Several people did something considerable here, she said. I had help. He went. She stood in the yard after the sound of his horse faded and looked at the outbuildings and the corral and the windmill turning in the April morning. The sage along the ridge was coming in that particular fierce green of desert spring, brief and brilliant. The air smelled like new water and something she had been trying to name for weeks and had finally named possibility. She thought about a woman stepping down from a train in October with an iron box and $312 and a practical plan and no room left in herself for anything beyond survival. She thought about that woman with something close to affection. She went inside. Gideon was at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts, his reading glasses pushed to the top of his forehead. She had discovered the reading glasses in February. She had found them privately one of the most endearing things she had ever seen, not because they made him look different, but because they were the one small domestic detail he was slightly self-conscious about, the one crack in the composed, practical exterior through which something purely human showed. She had never said this. She had simply filed it in the place where she kept things worth knowing. He looked up when she came in. Dunbar, he said. Charges filed, she said. 18 counts. She sat across from him. It's done, the worst of it. He set down his pen. He looked at her across the table with the lamp between them and Survey asleep in the iron box on the shelf and the April light coming through the window over his shoulder. What do you want to do, he said. Today. Right now. She thought about it. Ride up to the North Meadow, she said. Just to see it. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression, the specific warmth she had learned to recognize as his version of everything being right. Then let's go, he said. They rode north in the April morning, both of them with Survey having attempted to follow them from the yard and having been gently redirected by Tomas, who had come for his biannual roof check and was more than equal to the task of containing a determined orange cat. The sage was coming in along the ridge trail. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the smell of new water from the snowmelt, and the sky above the Cimarron was that specific deep April blue she had come to think of as the color of being in the right place. They rode without hurrying. The horses were easy under them. She had been thinking since February about what to say when they reached the meadow. She had drafted several versions in the particular way she did things methodically from the outside edges inward. She had rejected several as too careful, too managed, too much the language of a woman who had spent years making herself fit inside spaces that did not fit. She was not going to do that. The North Meadow opened before them as the trail crested the last low rise, and she stopped Mesa and looked at it and forgot for a moment what she had planned to say. It was green. In April, in the desert, genuinely and startlingly green, the grass thick and new along the spring's edge, the water running clear and cold over pale rock, the ridge face rising behind it in layers of red and orange, and the deep rust of iron-rich stone. A stand of cottonwood marked the spring's upper reach, their new leaves shaking silver in the breeze. The whole flat was perhaps half an acre hemmed by rock on two sides and open on the third. To the long view south, the ranch buildings visible, small and solid below the windmill, turning the house with its east-facing window catching the morning light. Oh, she said. He had been watching her face. Yes, he said. They dismounted and walked to the spring. The water was cold enough that it ached. She tested it with her fingers. Snowmelt straight from the ridge, carrying the taste of high stone and clean air. Blanco bent and drank, and Mesa cropped at the new grass, and they walked the meadow's edge together in the silence that had become over the months, simply the texture of being near each other. At the far end where the cottonwood stand thinned and the view opened south, she stopped. The ranch below looked like something she had been moving toward without knowing it. The same careful, maintained intention she had seen from Okafor's wagon on her first October afternoon. The mended fencing, the orderly outbuildings, the windmill turning with the patient steadiness of a thing built to last. It was the same ranch. She was not the same person who had ridden toward it in October. Gideon, she said. Yes, she turned and looked at him. She had been thinking about this for months, arranging and rearranging the words because she was a woman who believed in precision and had learned that imprecision in important moments cost more than the discomfort of taking the time. But standing here in the North Meadow with the spring running cold behind her and the enormous patient sky overhead, the words she'd been arranging fell away entirely, and what came out was simply the truth. I want you to know something, she said. Not as a practical report, not as a situation update. I want you to know it because it's true, and because I have spent a great deal of my life not saying true things out loud, and I have decided I am done with that. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had always been good at it. I was afraid when I got off that train, she said. I was afraid of everything, of being wrong about you, of being wrong about this place, of wanting too much, and then losing it, of making myself small again, to fit inside something that didn't fit. She met his eyes. I am not afraid of any of that anymore. I am standing on land that I consider mine next to a man I have chosen, and I want you to know that the choosing was real. It was not practical arrangement. It was not the absence of alternatives. I have alternatives. I am aware of them. I am here because I am here by choice, because this is where I want to be. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. I know you know, she said. I needed to say it anyway. He reached out and took her hand, simply directly the way he did everything without ceremony, meaning it entirely. You're more than workable, he said. She laughed. She could not help it. Gideon Holt, she said. You have got to stop saying that. It's the highest thing I know how to say, he said. Then I will take it, she said, as the highest thing. He lifted her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips. Not a grand gesture, not performed for anyone. Just a quiet and precise acknowledgement of the fact of her, and then he held on, and they stood at the edge of the north meadow and looked at the land below and the sky above, and the country spread wide in every direction, enormous and patient and entirely theirs. What will you do with it? She asked. The meadow. He looked out at the grass in the spring. Secondary fence along the east face the rock formation will handle half of it. Water line down from the spring to extend the usable pasture below. Grass here will hold through June if we manage the grazing rotation properly. He paused. It doubles the north pasture capacity, maybe more. Tomas's cousin does fence work, she said. He's reliable. I asked Okafor. He looked at her. You already asked Okafor. I like to know what's available before the need arises, she said. He looked at the meadow, and something in his face was the expression of a man who has stopped being surprised and started being grateful, which is, she thought, the better state. We could start in May, he said, when the ground is right. We could, she said. The words sat between them, ordinary and large. That evening after supper, after Nora was in bed with survey stretched across her feet and her schoolwork stacked on the floor, Clara went to the kitchen and took the iron box down from the shelf. She held it in both hands for a moment. It was lighter than she remembered. Or perhaps she was stronger. She had been thinking in the past weeks that both things could be true, that what she was carrying could become lighter as she learned to carry it better, and that what she became could become stronger as the carrying required it. She set the box on the table. She sat down. She looked at it. The lock no longer locked anything. She had had the key since April 6 months ago. On the afternoon, Preston had pressed the box into her hands in the study of the Abilene house, with his face showing the particular expression of a man who has run out of time for the conversation he needed to have. She had kept the key on her person for 6 months, sewn into the hem of her riding coat alongside the money, and she had taken it out only twice, once in November in front of Vera Marsh, and once in December when she had packed the last of the documents for Cisco's second Santa Fe run. She opened the lid. Inside, nothing, empty, an echo of what had been. She had expected this. She had been the one who emptied it. And still the sight of it produced something she had not quite anticipated, not grief, not relief, something between the two. The feeling of a weight you have carried so long that when it is lifted, you are not simply lighter, but also uncertain of your own balance because you had organized yourself around the weight. She sat with that for a moment. Then she thought about all the things that had come from the box, not just the evidence, not just the federal case and the water rights ruling and Harlan's 18 counts. She thought about the letter Preston had written 4 pages in his careful hand that she had read once and folded carefully and kept. I hope it gives you freedom, he had written. She thought about Dalton Beecham gathering for 3 years from outside, while Preston gathered from inside, 2 men working in parallel without knowing it. She thought about Vera Marsh at the boarding house table in November, her journalist's eyes and her 3 years of work, and her absolute commitment to finishing what Dalton had started. She thought about Nora saying "you're ours" with the serene certainty of a child who has made up her mind. She thought about all of it, and she understood that the box had not merely contained evidence. It had contained everything that came after opening it. Gideon came in from checking the horses. He saw her at the table with the open box in front of her. He came and stood beside her without speaking, not filling space with words, but filling it with presence, which was something different and better. They looked at the empty box together. It's just a box now, she said. Yes, he said. When we make this official, she said. She had not said it directly before. She said it now because she was done with imprecision in important matters. When we file the papers and make the legal arrangement formal, I think I'd like Nora to have the option of Beecham as a middle name. Nora Beecham Holt. If she wants it when she's old enough to decide. He looked at her. Preston was not a good husband, she said. But he gave me the box, and the box gave me the case, and the case gave me this, and I don't want to erase him entirely. I want to place him correctly, in the right size place. Not more than he was, but not less than what he actually did. Gideon was quiet for a moment. That seems right, he said. I'll ask Nora. She'll have opinions, Clara said. She always does, he said, and something in his voice was warm within. She looked at the empty box on the table. She thought about placing it back on the shelf where Survey had claimed it, where it could simply be what it was now, a useful container with a history suitable for holding a cat. She closed the lid. She set the box back on the shelf at the far end, where Survey could have his sleeping spot undisturbed. Gideon reached past her and straightened it slightly on the shelf. A small gesture, entirely him. She turned and leaned it against his chest, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the kitchen shelf in the lamplight and looked at the empty box, which was no longer the center of anything. "The charges will take years to fully resolve," she said. "Yes. Harlan will appeal every finding. Probably. There will be hard days." He held her a little more firmly. "There will be, he said, "and we'll work through them." She looked at the lamp. She looked at the window facing east, which was dark now, but would show her morning in a few hours a specific light she had come to think of as simply the beginning of the day. "We will," she said. They stood together in the quiet kitchen of a house that was warm and settled into its nighttime configuration. And outside, the wind moved off the Cimarron Ridge and turned the windmill in the dark, and the stars came out over the mesa, enormous and indifferent and brilliant. The same stars she had watched from the train window in October, which had seemed then like things belonging to some other existence, and which seemed now like the sky she lived under. The lamp was lit. The house was warm. Survey shifted in the iron box on the shelf, adjusted himself, and went back to sleep with the thoroughness of a creature who has made his permanent decision about where he belongs. She was home. She had been running toward this since April without knowing what it was running from, what she knew running toward, something she hadn't been permitted to name even to herself. She had carried the box all the way to the Cimarron Ridge and set it down, and discovered in the setting down that what she had been protecting was not only evidence. She had been protecting the possibility of this, and she had arrived. In the spring, they rode up to the North Meadow again. All three of them this time, Gideon and Clara and Nora on her small Pinto, and Survey having made another attempt on the yard and been redirected by Tomas, whose patience with the cat appeared inexhaustible. The sage was in full bloom along the ridge trail. The sky was that deep, unambiguous blue that has no equivalent in flat country light, the blue of altitude and open space, and a sky that goes on without interruption until it becomes something else entirely. The meadow was greener than it had been in April. The grass had come in along the full length of the spring, new and thick, and the cottonwood stand was full-leafed, shaking silver in the late morning breeze. Nora ran ahead to crouch at the water's edge, her boots very close to getting wet, which was traditional, and Gideon walked to the section of the east face where the fence work had been started and stood looking at it with the particular expression of a man assessing the progress of a thing he has planned for a very long time. Clara came and stood beside him. "The east line should be done by end of June," he said. "Tomas's cousin works fast." "He does," she said. "I checked the posts last Thursday. The footings are solid." He looked at her. "You checked the posts." "I like to know the state of things," she said. He looked back at the fence line. Something in his expression was the thing she had been trying to find the exact word for since December, and she had finally settled on it. It was the expression of a man who has been alone for a very long time and has discovered almost accidentally that he is not alone anymore, and who has not yet finished understanding what that means, but finds it entirely good. In June, he said, "When the line is done, I want to run the north herd up here. See what the grass will hold. The spring capacity should handle 30 head through summer," she said. "Possibly more if the rains come in on schedule." "They usually do," he said. "July rains. You can set your calendar by them." She looked at the meadow. "I intend to," she said. He looked at her. "What does that mean?" he said. "It means I'm planning to be here in July to see them," she said. "And in August. And in the following October, which will be 1 year since I stepped off the train, and which I think deserves some kind of acknowledgement, though I haven't decided what kind yet." "I'll leave the acknowledgement to you," he said. "You're better at decisions of that type." "You're better at them than you think," she said. "I think you're planning to stay," he said. "I was planning to stay before the snow," she said. "I said so. You said good." "I remember," he said. "Then why are you asking?" He looked at the meadow. "Because I like hearing you say it," he said. She looked at him. At the profile she had learned over 7 months, the specific weight of his jaw, the way the silver at his temples had extended slightly, In the cold months, the small line that appeared at the corner of his eye when he was suppressing something he found either amusing or worth protecting. I'm planning to stay, she said. I am staying. This is where I live. He turned and looked at her, full direct with all of it visible. Good, he said. Nora appeared at their shoulders. If you're done, she said with the serenity of a child who has been monitoring her parents' progress with the thoroughness she applied to everything important. The horses are getting into the cottonwood. Gideon looked at his daughter. Which horse? He said. Blanco, Nora said. He's eating the low branches. You know he does that. I know he does that, Gideon agreed. They walked back across the meadow, all three of them and the horses, in the enormous patient sky overhead. And the spring ran clear behind them, and the sage was warm in the sun, and below, small and solid against the red earth, the ranch waited with its windmill turning and its east-facing window catching the light. Clara looked at it. She thought about the train platform in October and the locked box and the letter that was badly spelled in places and honest in every single one. She thought about all the things the letter had not told her and all the things she had found anyway and how the unplanned things had turned out to be the things worth keeping. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere. Then she mounted Mesa and turned him toward home, and they rode back through the spring morning with the sun in the sky and the red earth spreading out wide around them, and she was not afraid of any of it. Gideon, she said. Yes, he said. We're going to be all right. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ridge and at the ranch below and at the enormous patient country that did not know any of them and did not need to. I think so too, he said. Above them, the sky held its ancient patient blue. A hawk turned slow and easy on the spring thermals, riding something invisible, going nowhere in particular, entirely at home in the open air. They rode until the ranch came up to meet them. Then they went inside.